It was a late afternoon in the quiet suburbs of Portland, where the sun cast long, tired shadows across a dusty parking lot, and the air hung thick with the hum of idling engines and the shuffle of weary footsteps. Rachel weaved her way through the crowded rows of parked cars, holding a crumpled paper bag of groceries close to her chest, her thoughts already drifting toward dinner and the comfort of home. It was an ordinary day. It should have stayed that way. But then she saw it. A single shopping cart, left abandoned near the fire exit, sat crooked against the concrete. One of its front wheels bent awkwardly to the side, as if someone had rolled it just far enough before letting go, not caring where it stopped. Rachel barely noticed it at first. She might have kept walking, but something in her peripheral vision shifted, a movement so small and soft that it didn't register as danger or noise, only as something not right. She turned, more curious than concerned, and looked again. Inside the cart, there was no clutter, no bags, no forgotten groceries. But curled into the far corner, half-shadowed and barely breathing, was something living, something trying very hard not to be seen. It was a puppy. A German shepherd, no more than 4 months old, with patchy, matted fur the color of ash and autumn leaves. His ears drooped low, heavy with sadness or sickness or both, and his round eyes were wide open not out of fear, but from watching the world in absolute silence. He didn't make a sound. No bark, no whimper. Just the stillness of a creature who had given up calling for help. There was something haunting in his gaze. Something that stretched far beyond his weeks on earth, a quiet, hollow depth, like the surface of a lake forgotten at the end of summer. The puppy didn't move. He didn't flinch or growl or brace for touch. Instead, he stayed completely still, pressed into the edge of the cart like he wished he could disappear into the metal, his chin resting gently on a worn blue stuffed elephant. The toy was frayed and faded, with one ear torn and the seams unraveling. But the way he held on to it said more than words ever could. That little elephant was all he had, left a thread of comfort, a trace of memory, or maybe just a habit his heart couldn't let go of. Rachel looked around, half expecting someone to come running back. But nothing happened. The cars kept moving. People passed by, everyone was busy. No one noticed the cart, and even fewer could have seen the fragile little body inside it. To them, it was just another piece of clutter in a parking lot. But not to her. She set her grocery bag down beside the curb, slowly, like she was afraid to scare the silence away. Then, without speaking, without reaching in, she crouched down. Not to rescue. Not yet. Just to be there. The sunlight hadn't reached this part of the pavement, and a cool shadow stretched across the cart's wheels. Rachel stayed in that shadow, her body still, her breath even, doing nothing except being present. The puppy lifted his gaze. He didn't retreat, but he didn't inch closer either. He studied her, as if trying to decide something deeper than trust, something buried beneath layers of being forgotten. There was a question in his eyes, but it didn't ask for words. It was instinct, shaped by disappointment, shaped by being passed over too many times. And in that quiet moment between them, there was the faintest flicker of something else, something almost too delicate to name. Hope. Not much, but enough to stay alive. Rachel didn't say a word. She didn't move closer. She didn't move away. 2 living beings, 1 woman and 1 wounded pup, sat quietly in the middle of a noisy, indifferent world, wrapped in a strange and gentle silence that set them apart from everything else, as if the parking lot itself had faded into the background just to make space for this one moment. A breeze swept through, carrying the scent of cinnamon bread from the cafe around the corner, mixing with dust and the fading heat of the late afternoon. The puppy blinked once. He didn't curl deeper into the cart. He didn't turn his head away. His ears still hung low, but his eyes, they had changed. Just slightly. Like something inside him had shifted from suspicion to curiosity, and without speaking, he was asking, "What is she going to do to me?" Rachel heard the question, even though it was silent, and she answered not with words, not with movement, but with the one thing this little creature hadn't known in a long time. She stayed. The pavement beneath her warmed as the sun slid lower in the sky. Still, she remained there. People walked by. Some glanced at the cart for a second. No one stopped. No one came closer. They didn't see what was inside. But Rachel did. A young mother passed with 2 children in tow, both chattering and skipping behind her. The littlest girl pointed at the cart, her face lighting up. "Mommy, look! A puppy!" The mother gave a quick glance, then tugged her child's hand a little harder. "Don't touch it. It's dirty," she said, not even slowing her pace. And just like that, they were gone. But Rachel stayed. And the puppy, still clinging to his little stuffed elephant, still watching her with eyes that had stopped expecting anything good, didn't look away. And maybe, just maybe, in that fragile space between fear and belief, for the first time in a very long time, he felt seen. Blue didn't react. He stayed where he was, his head buried into the old stuffed toy, as if nothing else around him existed or even mattered anymore. Rachel swallowed hard. She didn't blame anyone out loud, but deep inside her chest, something quiet stirred. It felt like the sound of a breath you don't realize you've been holding, or maybe the soft, subtle crack of something delicate breaking in a place too deep to name. Her eyes began to study him more closely now. His ears were flattened tight against his head, completely still. His belly was sunken, his fur covered in a thin layer of grime and bits of paper dust. Some parts had clumped into small, hardened patches, the kind that told stories of days gone without care. His front legs were tucked tightly beneath him, not in comfort, but in readiness, like he was poised to pull himself further away the moment someone reached too close. Rachel didn't move. She leaned in slightly, just enough to let her voice carry, and whispered barely a breath. Barely a sound, the kind of greeting you offer to a soul you're not sure is still holding on. "Hey there, little guy." But Blue didn't lift his head. He didn't turn toward her. He simply shifted a little deeper into the corner of the cart, clutching the tattered blue elephant even tighter between his front paws. Like anything unfamiliar, even kindness might make it vanish. Time slowed around them, stretching thin like the long afternoon shadows under the rows of parked cars. Footsteps continued to echo past. Sunlight flickered between bumpers, and the world moved on as if nothing had happened. Yet right there, in the middle of that ordinary chaos, was a dog who had become completely invisible. And the one person who had chosen to see him. Blue didn't know who Rachel was. He didn't understand why she was sitting there. He couldn't have recognized the expression in her eyes, that quiet ache, that steady gentleness, even though it looked so much like something he'd once known. Or perhaps never had the chance to. But Rachel didn't try to change any of that. She didn't plead. She didn't offer out her hand. She didn't invade the space between them with good intentions that came too fast. Instead, she simply remained still, watching softly, sitting as if she were asking without words for permission to just be there. And somehow, without even meaning to, her stillness said more than words ever could. It asked nothing. It promised nothing, but it startled nothing either. A breeze passed again, softer this time, carrying with it the faint scent of soap and wet pavement from the car wash at the edge of the lot. Rachel inhaled, and something in her shifted. This wasn't the first hour Blue had spent here. He hadn't just been left in the last 10 minutes. She could tell by the smell of fur that had been baking in the sun, by the dust settled behind his ears, and most of all by that expression in his eyes that he had been waiting. He had waited for someone, maybe even believed they would come back. But no one had. No one had seen Blue. Except her. But Blue hadn't yet seen Rachel as anyone. To him, she wasn't a rescuer. She wasn't a threat. She wasn't familiar. She was just a shape nearby, a presence, but not a dangerous one. And in the world Blue lived in now, that alone was rare. A human who didn't come closer, who didn't walk away, who simply stayed. Quiet. Still. As if that simple act of staying might be all he needed not to retreat again. Rachel's stomach growled softly, a reminder she hadn't eaten since morning. She reached into her bag and felt the crumpled wax paper of something she'd nearly forgotten. Half of a grilled chicken sandwich with melted cheese from earlier that day. The smell of roasted meat and warm bread drifted upward, subtle but comforting. And not just to her. She carefully tore off a small piece. But instead of holding it out or tossing it toward the cart, she leaned forward and gently placed the piece on the pavement a short distance from the shopping cart, far enough to feel safe, but close enough to be noticed. Then, without a word, she backed away. Slowly. No calling. No clapping. No coaxing. She returned to her original spot, right where the silence had begun. Blue didn't move. His head didn't turn. But his eyes never left her. Not once. As if he was still studying her, still trying to understand why this human wasn't doing what all the others had done. Time seemed to stretch again, the way it does in moments when breath and stillness are all that remain. Sunlight tilted lower, casting golden angles through windshield glass and wheel wells. Somewhere in the distance, a car rolled slowly out of its spot. Children laughed faintly. The city murmured on. But between them in that quiet space where nothing else reached it was just Rachel and the dog. And the waiting. 10 minutes passed. Blue moved. Not much, just a slight shift, the kind so subtle it could have been missed. His nose extended forward, cautious, deliberate. His eyes remained wide, alert to every motion, reading the air, reading her. But his body no longer clung to the cart's corner like it was the edge of the world. One paw stepped out. Then another. 4 silent steps forward. No rush. No fear. Just slow, tentative progress. Blue lowered his head and sniffed the piece of sandwich. Not with hunger that pounced, but with the kind of inspection reserved for something sacred, as if he were trying to understand the entire world through the scent of a small piece of food. And then, without hesitation, he took it. Just a soft bite. He pulled the piece gently back into the corner of the cart, returned to his space beside the torn blue elephant, and began to eat. Slowly, bit by bit. Rachel exhaled, barely audible. She didn't move, didn't celebrate. She only pressed her lips together, as if trying to trap this moment inside her, hold it tight like a fragile reel of film she never wanted to rewind too fast. Time passed. An hour, then another. The sun dipped lower, drawing the shadow of the shopping cart long across the pavement like a stretched silhouette. The heat began to ease, its bite softened by the coming dusk. People moved in and out of the lot, some looking for their cars, some checking their phones, but none of them noticed the quiet pair in the corner. One woman, one dog. Together, without words, without movement. Just sharing breath and space. Eventually, Blue lay down again. But this time he didn't tuck himself so deep into the corner. He didn't vanish. Instead, he curled up beside his stuffed elephant, just a little closer to the edge, a little closer to her. Rachel steadied herself on her palms, her eyes never leaving him. Something stirred deep in her chest. Not pity. No. Something more layered than that. Something heavier. It felt like being chosen, not in a grand, dramatic moment, but in the soft, silent way a wounded soul tests the air around them and decides that, maybe, this time, it might be okay. She didn't speak loudly. She didn't even know if he would understand or care, but she said it anyway because she needed to. "If you've been waiting for someone to come back," she whispered, more to the sky than to him, "maybe today, that someone is me." Her voice barely reached beyond the cart. It was a confession folded inside a promise, and she said it gently, as if the very sound might snap something too delicate to fix. Blue didn't respond, not with his body, not with sound, not with movement. He just lay there, beside the one-eared elephant, his eyes turned toward the supermarket entrance where the crowd had started to thin. Evening settled in. The sun had begun to disappear behind the rooftops in the distance, and what light remained scattered across windshields, dancing in soft blurs that shimmered like tears yet to fall. Rachel stayed where she was, seated now on concrete that had turned cool beneath her. She folded her knees close, placed her hands behind her for balance, and watched him. For a long time, she said nothing. Then quietly, just above a breath, she asked, "Who are you waiting for?" There was no answer. Blue's gaze remained fixed on the parking lot's exit, still, unwavering, unblinking like he was watching for a face in the crowd that had never arrived. And that look, it wasn't angry. It wasn't bitter. It was something much sadder than that, a hollow waiting, as if asking the one question that dogs can never speak aloud. Why haven't they come back? Fewer and fewer people passed by. A little boy tried to run toward them, pointing with delight, shouting, "Mom, a puppy!" But the mother barely glanced, her voice clipped and fast as she tugged him away. "Don't touch it, it's dirty." They didn't look back. Blue didn't flinch, he didn't run, he didn't chase or hide. He only nestled himself deeper into the old cart, his head resting gently on his front paws, the torn blue elephant held tight against his chest like a lifeline made of fabric and memory. Rachel gently curled her fingers into a fist, then slowly released them. Her eyes stayed fixed on Blue, quietly tracing every detail, not with curiosity, but with a kind of reverence, the kind reserved for things too fragile to touch. His ears drooped low, not in reaction to sound, but in surrender, like they had learned there was no point in listening anymore. His belly was tight, the kind of hollow that came from missing meals for more than just a day. His fur clung to him in patches, dusty and slick from dried sweat and time spent too long under the sun. But it was his eyes that made it hardest for Rachel to breathe. Blue didn't cry, but in those eyes was a silent kind of weeping, a grief that didn't make noise, a question that no one had ever stopped to answer. A long, aching weight that had slipped too far into being forgotten. A breeze passed, light but sharp, and Rachel instinctively pulled her jacket closer around her. Still, she didn't look away. There was a heaviness in her chest, not from what Blue had shown her, but from everything he no longer showed. And that's when she understood. Blue wasn't hoping a kind stranger might save him. He was waiting for someone specific, someone who had once looked him in the eye, made a promise, and left. And maybe, just maybe, he still hadn't let himself believe that promise had been broken for good. It was nearing 5 p.m. Store employees began gathering carts from around the lot, herding them back to the corner in practiced silence. One middle-aged man approached, reaching for the handle of the cart where Blue was still curled up. Rachel rose instantly, her voice steady but firm. "Wait, there's a dog here." The man paused. He glanced down, and finally saw the small figure in the shadows. He nodded once, quietly, then walked away without a word. Rachel sat back down. Blue didn't look at her. His gaze stayed trained on the edge of the lot, the place where people came and went. Every time a door opened, every time a shoe struck pavement, he lifted his head just slightly, and then lowered it again. Once, twice, 3 times, until no one came through anymore. The sliding doors of the store finally closed for the night. The steady murmur of traffic faded. The overhead lights flickered on, casting a low, golden hue across the quieting lot. And still, Rachel remained not speaking, not moving, not asking anything. Then it happened. For the first time, Blue stopped looking at the gate. His eyes shifted. Not fast, not clear, but unmistakable. He looked at her. And it wasn't just a glance. It was different, like something inside him, something old and tired and afraid, had finally turned ever so slightly toward her. It wasn't trust, not yet. But it was movement, like the sky beginning to break apart after the last frost of winter, not warm yet, but no longer cold. Rachel didn't dare shift her weight. She stayed exactly where she was, even holding her breath without realizing, her body calm but alive with quiet hope. Her eyes didn't lock onto him, didn't push. They followed his face with softness, almost as if whispering, "I'm not going to scare you. I promise." Blue didn't come closer. But he didn't turn away either. He simply sat there, half in the shadow of the shopping cart, half lit by the golden spill of light from the first overhead lamp that had flickered to life at the edge of the lot. Rachel's hands stayed on the pavement, palms open, fingers relaxed and facing up, not waving, not signaling. Just there, like an invitation written in silence. A few more minutes passed. Blue blinked. Slowly. Once. He moved his head just a little, then stopped. The evening wind swept softly through the lot, stirring a few dry leaves into motion before carrying them away. A car horn echoed from somewhere in the distance. Then everything stilled again, the way it does when the world pauses just enough for someone to notice the silence. Rachel leaned forward, but only slightly. Not to close the space, not to reach. Just enough so Blue could see she wasn't towering above him, wasn't coming at him, wasn't trying to force anything. Her voice, when it came, was barely more than a breath. "If you're scared, that's okay. I've been scared too." Blue tilted his head. Not much, but enough. His ears stayed low, still folded down, but one twitched upward just a little as if something in her tone made him want to listen. The blue stuffed elephant was still pressed to his chest, but Blue's body no longer looked like it was bracing for impact. He wasn't curled into himself like before. He was still tired, still thin, still fragile. But there was a softness in his shape now, a tiny shift, like he had placed one of the heavy stones he'd been carrying, gently to the ground. Rachel saw it, and she knew better than to rush it. The biggest changes, the ones that last, they always begin this way, not with a leap, but with something so small that only someone who truly stays will ever notice. "You don't have to trust me yet," she said softly, her words warm and even. "Just let me sit with you. That's all." Blue's eyes landed on her hand. He didn't move forward, but he didn't pull away either. So now, it was Rachel's turn to wait. She had waited for a lot of things in her life, the results of her mother's medical scans, an apology that never came, a friend to return after a fight that left too many words unsaid. But she had never waited for anyone quite like this, in total stillness, with nothing but quiet hope and a hand turned gently upward on the ground. And somehow, Blue in all his silence made her feel more alive, than any answer ever had. No leash, no contract, no spoken promise. Just two souls, one human, one dog trying to believe in each other, with nothing to go on but instinct and something tender that couldn't be named. Then Blue lowered his head. He didn't rush toward her. He didn't wag. He didn't make a sound. He simply let his chin rest against the edge of the shopping cart, right at the spot closest to her hand. Not touching her, but close enough for Rachel to feel it. The soft exhale of breath, the quiet presence of a life still choosing in that moment to stay. She smiled for the first time. Not because she'd won, not because she'd convinced him of anything, but because Blue had made a choice. And that choice was not to run. The parking lot had thinned, the air had cooled, the golden lights above hummed faintly as they spilled down over the cracked pavement, casting Blue's shadow long beside the cart. It stretched out beside him like a quiet second self, no longer hiding. Rachel rose slowly, brushing the dust from the hem of her dress, careful not to make any sudden sounds. Then she turned and walked toward her car. A silver-gray SUV, old but clean. Always ready for rescues she never planned on. She didn't look back. She didn't call his name. She didn't wave or coax or say a single word. She simply opened the back door and left it open. That was her invitation, and she knew by now the right kind doesn't need to be spoken out loud. Rachel walked slowly around to the front of the car, climbed into the driver's seat, and stayed still. Her hands didn't reach for the keys. Her eyes lingered in the rearview mirror. The car's interior lights flickered once, then settled into a soft glow. Blue was still sitting at the edge of the shopping cart. He hadn't moved. Only the little blue elephant was pulled tighter against his chest. Rachel glanced down at the steering wheel, her fingers resting in her lap. For a moment, hesitation passed through her like a ripple, quiet, uncertain, but she took a breath and let it steady her. The night air had begun to cool. It carried the faint smell of warm tires, worn asphalt, and something else. Something still and strange and sacred. And then Blue moved. It seems Blue is being very careful with his movements, one step at a time. His front paws touched the pavement first, back legs still caught slightly on the dented edge of the cart. There was a soft shuffle of fur and metal, barely a sound, and then Blue was on the ground. He didn't wag his tail, didn't lower his head. He just walked. Not toward Rachel, but toward the open car door. Each step still carried caution, but the kind born from experience, not fear. He kept space between them, not too close, but no longer hiding. And in that distance, something brave was unfolding. Blue climbed in. His whole small body curled protectively around that worn, stuffed elephant. Rachel watched through the mirror as he settled into the back corner of the seat. He didn't curl into a tight ball this time. He didn't raise his head either. He just sat there, still and alert, like he was keeping himself steady from the inside out. He didn't look at her, but he wasn't planning to leave. Rachel let out a soft, weightless smile, the kind that floats up not because everything is solved, but because something true has just begun. She whispered, not just to him, but maybe also to herself. "We're just going home, that's all. And if you don't want to stay, we can come back tomorrow." Blue didn't move. But this time his silence didn't feel like doubt. It felt like a quiet kind of yes. Rachel turned the key. The engine hummed to life. Headlights stretched across the empty lot, painting a path forward into the night. Behind them, the rows of shopping carts and empty spaces slowly faded into shadow until there was nothing left but light ahead and the warmth of not being alone. The car began to move, tires rolling softly over the cracked pavement. Blue didn't stir. He didn't look back. He simply lay down in the back seat, pressing the worn, stuffed elephant tightly to his chest, like it was the last piece left of a world he used to know. And Rachel, though her hands trembled gently on the steering wheel, felt something settle inside her. A quiet peace, low and steady. No one could say for sure what this was the beginning of. There was no map, no plan. Just an old car, a woman who had been hurt before, and a small dog who had finally stopped waiting for someone to come back. Now. The two of them were heading toward a place they'd never called home before. Rachel opened the front door. The scent of old wood and cinnamon drifted softly into the air. The house sat quietly at the end of a sleepy street, where the trees stood still and the windows rarely stayed shut for long. She set the bag down gently on the floor, not bothering to turn on the ceiling light. Only the soft amber glow of a table lamp lit the room, casting long shadows across the worn beige sofa, the fraying edges of an old rug, and the kind of quiet that feels made for two hearts too tired to be seen. Rachel didn't look at Blue. She just walked into the kitchen, pulled a clean bowl from the cabinet, filled it with cool water, and reached up into the cupboard for the last bag of kibble she'd kept from a past rescue. She carried both into the living room and placed them gently near a folded blanket against the wall. No words, no sound. Blue stepped inside, each pawfall silent and measured. He didn't rush. He wasn't afraid, but he didn't come to her either. Instead, he lowered the stuffed blue elephant onto the blanket first, then curled his body beside it. His head rested on the toy like it was the one thing in the world he still trusted to hold. He didn't eat. He didn't drink. He just lay there, eyes wide open, gazing into a place Rachel couldn't follow. She sat down on the sofa, wrapping her arms around a throw pillow like it might help hold her together. She glanced sideways. Both of them were in the same space, but like two planets orbiting different suns. She didn't call his name, didn't clap or coax. She understood. Trust doesn't arrive with a meal or a blanket. It asks for presence and time. Outside, the night crept in quietly. The wind nudged at the window panes. The lamp sent a soft trail of gold across the wooden floor. Rachel didn't sleep. She just leaned back, eyes fixed on that corner of the room, the one now occupied by a small shape curled around a memory. Now and then, Blue blinked. Slow. Gentle. Not from tiredness. More like he was checking to make sure this wasn't some kind of dream. That the parking lot really was behind him now. Rachel exhaled for the first time in hours. She pulled a thin blanket across her lap, though her eyes never left him. It wasn't closeness, not yet. But it was something else. Something just far enough from loneliness to feel like hope. She didn't need Blue to run over and lick her hand or press into her chest. All she needed was this, that he hadn't turned his back. In the stillness of that night, a woman and a wounded dog shared the same silence. No one touched the other, but both of them, without saying a word, had started to open a small door slowly to hold space for each other. And sometimes, that's more powerful than trust. Rachel shifted slightly on the old sofa, lying on her side, the blanket resting lightly over her knees. Midnight had passed, but her eyes stayed open. She wasn't afraid of sleep. She just didn't want to miss anything. Because across the room, Blue was still awake. Blue lay beside the blanket near the window, the lamp casting a quiet glow over his folded ears, and the small, still shape of him curled up like a silent comma in a sentence not yet finished. Then a small movement. Blue stood up. Shall we continue? The moment that follows is quiet but deeply meaningful, There was no sharp sound, just the soft, gentle tapping of claws against old wooden floorboards. Blue walked slowly, every step as if he was testing the space, reading the rhythm of every heartbeat in the room. Rachel didn't move. She didn't turn. Didn't speak. Only her eyes followed him, this small, quiet creature making his way closer. Blue didn't jump on the couch, didn't whine, didn't try to be seen. Instead, with a stillness that felt more like grace than hesitation, he placed the blue elephant, that one worn, frayed toy, at Rachel's feet. Then he stood there. No demand, no expectation, no asking for reward. He just stood, as if this was the only way he knew how to say something. And the only thing he had left to say was through presence. Rachel looked down at the toy. One ear was torn, its fur patchy and matted, but it had been placed with such care, like a gift, a greeting, a fragile thread of trust finally extended. Her chest tightened. She whispered his name. Barely a breath, as though sound itself might shatter the stillness around them. Blue. Just one word, not a command, not a call, just a whisper from her heart to his. Blue tilted his head slightly, a small movement. But it said everything. He didn't bark, he didn't come closer, but even that little turn was enough to make Rachel feel that maybe, just maybe, the name had always been his. Maybe he'd been waiting for someone to give it to him, someone who would speak it softly and stay. Rachel didn't reach out, didn't praise. She just smiled, gently, quietly. For the first time that night, her lips curved not out of pity, not out of pride, but because Blue had chosen to come near. Not by force, not out of fear, but on his own. He curled beside the couch, his back resting lightly against the edge of the blanket. He didn't ask for space on the sofa. Didn't need anything more. He just wanted to be close enough to feel someone breathing beside him. Rachel pulled the blanket a little closer, not for herself, but so Blue wouldn't feel the night's chill. And in that quiet moment, without touch or words, they began something real, something fragile, something human. Shall we keep going? The silence between them is just starting to speak. And in that quiet, fragile moment, two souls, each once left behind by the world, found themselves side by side, sharing a night that neither of them had ever known before. There were no words, but that night, Rachel gave a name. And Blue accepted it the only way he knew how, with a glance, a gentle tilt of his head, and a presence close enough to call it a beginning. Morning hadn't fully arrived, but light had started to stretch softly through the slits of the window blinds. On the old sofa, Rachel still lay still, her head resting lightly on her arm. She hadn't really slept. Every breath she took felt like it was still listening, still waiting. And when her eyes finally blinked open, what she saw first wasn't the ceiling. It wasn't the clock on the wall. It was Blue. He was lying right at the foot of the couch now, not tucked into some corner like the night before, not curled into himself like he was preparing to run. Blue was stretched out, legs folded beneath him, his head resting quietly against the base of the couch, so close that if Rachel simply let her hand drop, she could have brushed his fur. The little blue elephant was still there, tucked gently between his front paws. But this time, Blue's eyes were open, and he was looking straight at her. There was no defensiveness in that gaze, no fear, no sadness heavy enough to sink a heart. Just a calm, quiet question, one so soft it felt like it had been carried in by the morning light itself. "Can I stay?" Rachel didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She just looked at him for a long moment, and then slowly nodded. No promises, no explanations, just a small, nearly invisible gesture. But somehow it was everything, and Blue understood. He didn't bark, didn't jump up, didn't need any big sign to believe it was real. Instead, Blue gently closed his eyes, not from exhaustion this time, but from relief. His head still rested on the couch's edge. His back stayed pressed near Rachel's legs, and his breathing, light as it was, no longer held that trembling uncertainty. Rachel let her hand hover near the back of the couch, right above where Blue lay. Not touching him, just near. A quiet reply of her own. Outside, sunlight had begun spilling across the doorstep, warm and golden. Rachel got up slowly and walked to the kitchen. She filled a clean bowl with water, then prepared some dry food and a few leftover pieces of roasted chicken. Nothing fancy, nothing loud, just enough to say, "This is your home too." Shall we keep going into Chapter 3? The story's just beginning to breathe. Blue didn't run after her. He didn't leap with joy or trail at her heels, but his eyes, they never left her. Not once, from the moment Rachel left the couch to the second she returned. There was no leash, no command, nothing tethering him to her, only the quiet longing to stay. And sometimes, for those who carry invisible wounds, simply being allowed to stay, to not be pushed away, is already a miracle in itself. That night, rain began to fall. Not in torrents, not with thunder or rage, just a steady, rhythmic whisper against the tin roof, each drop landing like the sky was deep in thought, trying to say something it hadn't found the words for. Rachel turned off the lights earlier than usual. She was tired, worn thin after another long day at the center. The soft golden glow from the corner lamp dimmed slowly, making room for the tender hush of darkness that gathered in the living room. She pulled a thin blanket over herself, lying curled on the old sofa, and listened to the rain as it fell, a sound steady and comforting, like the breathing of a place too gentle to be real. Blue lay on the floor, not far, like every other night, still keeping that small distance, not closer, but no longer retreating either. He lay still, head resting on his front paws, ears twitching now and then in response to the sounds outside. The little blue elephant faded and frayed, stayed nestled close to his side, the one thing he had clung to when the rest of the world turned its back. Rachel opened her eyes and looked down. Blue was looking up. There was no wagging tail, no pleading expression, just presence quiet, but fully there. She let her eyes close again, pulling in a long, slow breath. But something shifted. Not a noise, not a nudge, just a warmth, soft, steady leaning into the edge of the couch. Blue had moved, not quickly, not hesitantly, just closer. Rachel didn't move. She didn't want to shatter the moment. She lay there, still, listening. Blue rested his head lightly on the rug, just beside the sofa's edge, so near that Rachel could feel his breath rise against the worn fabric, a warm pulse of life in the hush between them. Not from exhaustion, but almost as if he were confirming that she was still there. No one spoke. Rachel slowly extended her hand, not to pet or pull, but simply to let it hang over the couch's side just near enough to offer. Just close enough to say, without saying, "If you need it, my hand is here." Blue didn't glance up, but he didn't leave. Between the whisper of rain on the roof and the dim shimmer of a night without a full moon, the silence wrapped itself around them not as distance, but as the strongest thread that could tie two broken things together. A woman and a dog, both carrying scars of different shapes, learning slowly, gently how to stay near one another without fear. And then, something beautiful happened. Blue inched forward just slightly, only enough for the side of his head to touch the inside of Rachel's wrist. It wasn't a plea, it wasn't a test, it was just a touch. And in that wordless moment, trust breathed its first fragile breath between them. Would you like to continue into the next morning? Or pause here? There was no sound, no dramatic cue, no sudden movement to mark the moment. Just a stillness so delicate, it felt like even the dust in the morning light had paused to witness it. But Rachel, with her heart tuned now to the faintest shifts, felt it before she even opened her eyes. The weight of fear had shifted. Blue, who had come into her life curled into the farthest corner of an old shopping cart, who hadn't dared to believe anyone might stay, was still there stretched out at the foot of the couch, not hiding, not curled in on himself, but simply present in the soft warmth between night and day. She stirred gently beneath the thin blanket, letting her eyes open slowly. And the first thing she saw wasn't the familiar ceiling or the aging clock on the wall, but a pair of eyes looking straight back at her deep brown, steady, and startlingly quiet. They weren't the eyes of a dog waiting to run, or bracing for disappointment, or scanning for danger. These were the eyes of someone who had waited the whole night just to make sure the morning would still include her. Blue didn't move. He didn't wag his tail or shift his paws. He just watched her, as if her waking was the only proof he needed that the world, at least for now, hadn't left him behind again. And Rachel, lying there in the pale light of early morning, felt something catch in her throat, not grief, not joy, but something in between. A soft ache, a recognition, the quiet realization that trust, when it arrives, doesn't shout or demand notice. It sits beside you, rests its head on your wrist in the dark, and waits for the sun. She sat up slowly, careful not to startle him, watching as his head tilted just slightly in response not out of alarm, but curiosity, the gentle kind that says, "I'm here. I'm listening." "Good morning," she whispered, not expecting a reply, just wanting to name the moment. Blue didn't respond the way dogs in movies might. He didn't leap or bark or bound with joy, but he didn't look away either. His gaze held hers with quiet steadiness, and in that silence, there was something louder than words. Rachel rose to her feet, slipping into her sweater and stepping barefoot onto the wooden floor, her movements slow, deliberate not because she was unsure, but because she wanted to give the moment room to breathe. The house around them was still cloaked in early light, the kind that makes everything feel softer, more forgiving. Outside, the porch glistened faintly from last night's rain, the stone path glimmering in patches where dew clung to the edges, and the garden still exhaled the cool scent of wet leaves and damp earth. She opened the front door, stepping out beneath a sky that seemed freshly painted, her feet brushing the slick stone as she turned, not to call, not to summon, but just to see. Inside, through the doorway, Blue sat where she'd left him. He didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, and she didn't beckon. She just waited quietly, like someone offering an invitation without pressure, a space without demands. And then, as naturally as morning follows night, Blue stood up. Not in a burst of energy, not with the spring of a puppy eager for praise, but with the slow, thoughtful steps of someone who had decided in his own time, on his own terms, that this place, this woman, this porch, this moment, might be worth walking toward. Slowly, without rush, Blue stepped past the doorway, his paws light against the morning dew, the familiar stuffed elephant dangling gently from his mouth. He didn't stop to sniff the wind, didn't scan the garden as other dogs might have. Blue walked forward with quiet certainty, as if the only thing that needed confirmation in that moment was whether Rachel was still there. And when Blue reached the edge of the stone steps, he sat beside her, not touching, not asking, just being near. Rachel folded herself gently onto the cool front step, resting her chin against her knees, eyes gazing out at the small garden that still held traces of the rain. She didn't speak, didn't reach for Blue. She simply sat with him just as Blue had learned to sit with her, without condition, without questions. A few minutes passed in peaceful silence before she tilted her head slightly and glanced sideways. Blue wasn't looking at her. Instead, his eyes were fixed on the weather-worn iron gate at the end of the garden path, the same gate that opened to the world he once came from, the world that had turned its back on him. But this time, Blue wasn't watching with longing. He wasn't asking if someone might return for him. He was simply watching something distant, something that felt like it had finally been closed. A chapter. A waiting. A wound. Rachel turned to look at him, and for the first time, she allowed herself to speak what had long been resting quietly in her heart. If that day I had just kept walking like everyone else, maybe right now you'd still be in that cold shopping cart. Blue didn't understand the words, not all of them. But Blue turned to her. And gently, without being called, without being fed, without any promise made, he placed his head on her knee. Not out of need, not out of habit, but simply because he wanted to. Rachel slowly leaned forward, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. She whispered, barely louder than the breeze, "Thank you for choosing to stay." There was nothing grand about the moment, just an old porch, a quiet morning, and an unspoken bond that didn't need to be proven. But for both of them, it was the beginning of something neither could name. 3 weeks later, Rachel filled out a volunteer form for a special program, one that trained dogs to sit beside children who had lost something, or someone, they could not name out loud. Blue didn't pass any rigorous evaluation. There were no formal tests he aced, no obedience certificates. But the moment the organizers saw how Blue sat beside Rachel without a leash, without a command, without wandering, they nodded. The first assignment was at a small center tucked behind a row of trees, where the halls were painted soft and the lights never too bright. It was a place for children who had lost parents to accidents, to illness, or simply to absence. That morning, Rachel walked with Blue down a long hallway. The faint yellow light overhead cast their shadows along the tiled floor, 2 figures side by side, moving like memory and meaning. Blue didn't bark, didn't pull at the leash, didn't sniff every door they passed. He just walked, like a shadow that finally knew where it belonged, not invisible, not forgotten. When they reached the final room, the door opened to reveal a square space filled with small chairs arranged in a loose circle. A handful of children sat scattered, one hunched over, one scribbling uneven lines on paper, another resting their head in the lap of a counselor. But in the far corner was a girl. Her hair fell across her face like a curtain, her body folded tightly around a stuffed animal that had clearly seen too much love. She didn't look up, didn't move, didn't even seem to notice anyone had entered. Rachel hadn't spoken yet, hadn't introduced herself or Blue. But Blue moved. He stepped away from her side, not running, not wagging, just walking slowly, quietly, like every inch of the floor deserved his full respect. He didn't walk straight up to the girl. He stopped a few feet away, gave her space, sat down no closer than an arm's length, and waited. Waited, like only someone who had known silence could. Blue didn't look at the girl, nor did he turn away. He simply remained anchored in stillness, a presence that asked for nothing, expected nothing, yet gave everything in its quiet way. 10 minutes slipped by in silence, The room was hushed, its air holding the kind of softness only time and pain could carve. No voices broke the stillness, no counselors moved to interfere. And then, without sound or signal, a shift occurred. It was small, almost imperceptible, a ripple beneath the surface of stillness. The girl shifted slightly, her shoulder rising just enough to catch a breath, and from beneath the veil of her long, tangled hair, a single finger slipped forward. It moved with the uncertainty of someone reaching through fog, as if unsure whether the world would meet her touch with warmth or more silence. The finger reached Blue's head. Blue didn't flinch. He didn't lean in or pull away. He simply remained where he was, unmoving, calm, as if his stillness was the very permission she needed. And then, without fanfare, her eyes lifted. She looked down at Blue. Not with expectation, not with fear, just presence. There were no words, no expression beyond that one glance, but after a moment something extraordinary happened. The corners of her lips, those small places that had forgotten how to move in joy, curled just slightly upward. It wasn't a smile most people would notice. It wasn't bright or confident. It was soft, like the breath before a whisper. Fragile, like morning mist rising from a field that's only now remembering sunlight. Rachel turned her head slightly, pretending not to notice, but her chest tightened. Her hand flew to her lips as her heart raced. She didn't want to speak, didn't want to break the stillness that held that moment together. Because she knew deeply, undeniably, that what she had just witnessed was not ordinary. It wasn't just a smile, it was a beginning. A moment of life returning to a child who had once lost the very rhythm of it. And Blue, still motionless, sat exactly as he had from the moment he entered. He had not moved closer. He had not made a sound. He simply offered presence, and when it was accepted, he responded not with movement, but with understanding. By the third Tuesday, Rachel and Blue returned to the same room, the same quiet space filled with tiny chairs arranged in a circle, and children who still couldn't speak the names of their grief. And there, in the same shadowed corner, the girl sat once more, her hair long and unbrushed, her arms tightly wrapped around the same threadbare stuffed fox. Blue noticed her. He didn't wait for Rachel to guide him. He didn't need a signal or a command. He stepped forward on his own, quiet as breath, moving through the circle with a grace that never asked for attention. He stopped halfway across the room, looked toward the corner, and slowly continued, never rushing, never closing the distance completely, only moving far enough to be near, but never too close to overwhelm. He lay down belly against the cool floor, head resting gently between his paws, eyes open but soft, not staring, not watching, just being. And in that quiet, his entire body spoke a language older than words, older than fear, a language that said, "I'm here, and I can wait." 5 minutes passed. Nothing changed. 10 minutes. Stillness. But within that stillness, something unspoken began to shift. Not visible, not loud, just a soft loosening like frost beginning to melt under morning sun. At the 20-minute mark, without a sound, the fox slipped from the girl's arms and onto the floor. Her hand, small and hidden beneath her hair, extended again slowly, searching, hesitant. It moved not toward the adults, not toward safety, but toward Blue. Blue stayed still, not leaning in, not reaching back, but allowing. Her fingers found the top of his head. A brush, a breath, a touch so faint it barely existed. And in return, Blue turned his head ever so slightly, the kind of movement only those who were watching closely would notice. But it said everything. "I know, and I'm not going anywhere." That's when it happened again. That fragile, almost invisible lift at the corner of her mouth. a smile so gentle it might have belonged to the wind. But it was there, real, present. Rachel closed her eyes briefly, hand still at her lips, holding in the wave rising in her chest, not because it hurt, but because it meant something had healed. Something had begun. No one clapped, no one spoke. But in that room, hearts paused, because they all knew they had witnessed a return, a first glance, a first touch, a first smile, since the day she'd buried her father. And Blue, faithful, quiet, unwavering, remained. Not needing applause, not needing praise, just being there, exactly when it mattered most, exactly where he had always meant to be. Ever since the day of her father's funeral, Blue had stayed in that spot, never asking for recognition, never seeking praise. Just present, just on time. The room stayed silent. But it wasn't an awkward silence. It was soft, like the room itself understood that the moment was enough. Nothing needed to be said. No explanation, no applause, no interpretation, just a quiet acknowledgement that something sacred had just happened. Blue still lay there, head tilted slightly, ears gently shifting as if they were listening to something no one else could hear. The girl remained in her usual place, but her eyes this time were no longer hidden behind her hair. You could see her now, you could feel her, and the space between her and Blue no longer felt like distance. Then, from the far corner near the window, another voice spoke up. It came from a boy, around 9, wearing thick glasses and holding his hands tightly together in his lap. His question was quiet, almost a whisper, as though speaking it too loudly might make it hurt all over again. Was he ever left behind? The room froze for a second. Rachel slowly sat beside Blue, but she didn't answer right away. She rested her hand lightly on Blue's back, the same way Blue had placed himself beside the pain of every child here gently, without expectation. Blue didn't move, didn't flinch, just stayed still as if his silence was its own kind of yes. Rachel's voice came soft, her gaze still on the boy. "Yes," she said. "Blue was left behind." And he waited for a long time. The boy gave a small nod. He didn't ask more, but something softened in his eyes like the weight of his own question had been shared, no longer something he had to carry alone. A girl sitting next to him, her curls loose around her shoulders, big round eyes filled with something fragile, leaned forward and asked, "Was he mad?" Rachel paused for a few seconds, then smiled gently. Maybe he was. But Blue didn't hold on to that. He only carried what he needed to make it here. Blue's eyes slowly swept the circle of children one by one. Not in a way that demanded attention, just enough so each of those small, quiet hearts felt seen. Then the first girl, the one who had smiled for the first time just moments ago, looked up at Rachel and asked, "If someone gets left behind, can they still be found?" Rachel nodded, but before she could say a word, Blue moved. Not fast, not eager, just certain. He walked forward and gently lowered himself right at the girl's feet. Not because she asked, not because anyone told him to, just because it was time. The girl reached out, this time without hesitation. Her hand rested on Blue's back, not shaky, not uncertain, but sure. And in that moment, without a single word spoken, every child in that room knew. Being left behind doesn't mean you stay lost. Sometimes, someone finds you. And when they do, they don't need to say much. They just need to stay. And at the end of that therapy session, a child who hadn't spoken a single word since losing her mother finally stepped out of the room, turned back, and whispered just loud enough for everyone to hear. "Blue's not a therapy dog. Blue is a friend." Just one simple sentence. But for Rachel, and maybe for everyone who witnessed that moment, that single sentence was enough to close a day no words could ever fully capture. A day when a once abandoned dog was called, for the very first time, by the name he truly deserved. It was late autumn. The sun had turned pale and the breeze was gentle, brushing through the backyard of the therapy center in a way that made the grass feel soft and kind beneath their feet. For the first time in weeks, the children were brought outside, weeks spent surrounded by pastel-painted walls trying to contain grief far too heavy for shoulders so young. Blue walked with the group. No leash needed. Since Rachel had enrolled him in the grief therapy program for children who had lost their parents, these weekly visits had become a quiet highlight. Blue wasn't fast, wasn't playful. He didn't know tricks. He didn't enjoy being petted too much. But Blue always knew how to sit beside the right person at the right time. That morning was no different. Blue picked a low patch of grass under a wide tree, settled there without fuss. He didn't join the games, didn't run in circles. He simply observed, staying close enough not to feel alone, but far enough not to make anyone feel crowded. Laughter rang across the lawn. A few kids chased soap bubbles. One was still learning how to tie their shoes. Rachel sat on a stone bench nearby, plucking a few dry leaves off Blue's back. Blue didn't turn around, but his tail stirred gently, his own quiet way of saying thank you. Then suddenly, a sharp sound sliced through the crisp morning air. A siren. An ambulance passing down the road just beyond the center. The wail echoed, sharp and piercing like a blade. A few children flinched, clapped hands over their ears, and Blue shot up. No growl, no bark, just launched like an arrow loosed from a bow straight toward the edge of the woods, his body tense, his movements instinctive, his eyes wild with a memory only he understood. "Blue!" Rachel called out, but her voice was steady, not loud, not frantic. A few staff members sprang up, ready to follow him, but Rachel raised a hand. "Wait," she said, her tone calm, measured. Someone asked, "Aren't you going after him?" Rachel kept her gaze fixed on the narrow trail where Blue had disappeared into the trees. She shook her head gently. "No," she murmured, almost to herself. "He'll come back. If Blue wants to come back, Blue will come back." Rachel lowered herself onto the wooden step at the edge of the lawn. Her back stayed straight. Both hands rested quietly on her knees. She didn't cry, didn't call out, didn't sigh. She just waited. 10 minutes passed. No one spoke. The children glanced at one another, then at Rachel, watching her the way one might watch someone fluent in a language they'd never heard before. A language of stillness, of trust, of patience. 15 minutes in, the soft rustle of leaves stirred from the tree line. A silhouette emerged from the forest's edge. Not rushing, not bounding with joy, just walking, deliberate, calm, every step steady as breath. Blue's eyes locked on Rachel. He didn't hang his head, didn't offer apologies. There was no shame, no theatrics. There was only a quiet truth. He had made his choice. Rachel smiled, small and gentle, no bigger than a nod. She didn't rise, didn't open her arms. She simply stayed seated, waiting, grounded, until Blue came on his own, settling beside her once more. His breathing is still fast, ears still low, but his tail no longer tucked beneath him. "You came back," she whispered, letting her palm rest lightly on his back. Blue didn't answer, but that didn't matter, because there are some questions in life that never need words, only the quiet presence of someone who chose to stay. 10 minutes. That's how long it takes for a song to play 3 times, for a meeting to end, for a kettle to boil. But in the therapy center's back garden that morning, 10 minutes stretched wide and heavy, like a breath no one dared let out. The siren had shattered the calm. A sharp cry from the ambulance, slicing clean through the sky. Blue had bolted towards the woods, drawn by something unseen, unspoken. No one could stop him. No one knew what had flashed through his mind in that split second. They only saw his form vanish into the trees, swallowed whole by the silence. Some of the kids stood up. One girl covered her mouth. A little boy reached for his friend's sleeve. A staff member approached Rachel, phone in hand, voice low but urgent. "I'll call the search team." Rachel shook her head. Her voice didn't rise, but something in it cut through the noise better than shouting. "If Blue doesn't want to stay, no one can make him." She said nothing more. She just sank down onto the low wooden step beneath the old tree, her eyes fixed gently on the path that led into the woods, hands resting in her lap. Calm, almost familiar, like someone who had waited before. Maybe too many times. No one moved. Even the children, usually so restless, so full of fidgets and chatter, sat in silence. Because somehow they understood. This moment didn't need sound. It needed faith. And time. And a kind of patience that didn't come from rules, but from the kind of love that says, if you come back, I'll still be here. 5 more minutes slipped by. The wind began to pick up, crisp and cool against the late afternoon light. A few brown leaves danced to the ground, carried by the hush that had settled over the lawn. A small boy, maybe 7 or 8, whispered to no one in particular, "Blue will come back, I think." And as if the forest itself had heard him, a shape began to form at the edge of the trees. First, 2 pointed ears, rising above the brush like tiny beacons. Then the outline of a familiar figure, emerging through dappled sunlight that flickered across the path like soft breath. Blue didn't rush, didn't bolt, just walked deliberately, steadily toward the exact place Blue had always chosen. Every step spoke of decision, not fear, of belonging, not obedience. No one called out, no one clapped. Blue simply returned to the patch of grass beneath the tree, the same shaded spot where Blue had always rested, calm, present, completely in control. Rachel hadn't moved. She remained seated, back straight, hands resting gently on her knees. But as Blue lowered down to the ground again, resuming the quiet position from before, Rachel's eyes softened. A small smile curved her lips, nothing performative, nothing for show. Just a private, wordless welcome. "You came back," she whispered, like a greeting carried only on breath. Software unforced. Enough. Blue didn't glance over, didn't wag, but the shape of the body had changed, no longer curled tight in worry, no longer tense with old habits of flinching. Just there. Settled. Staying. A little girl, watching from the edge of the playground, murmured almost to herself, "Blue wasn't held back. Blue chose to come back." Rachel turned toward her and gave the smallest nod. "And that," she said gently, "is worth more than any leash in the world." No one said anything else. But the quiet held something new. Not the stunned silence of earlier, but a reverent hush, as if everyone there had witnessed something they didn't have language for. A dog who had once been abandoned had now returned. Not out of fear, not out of training, but by choice, by trust, by something stronger than any command. But just as everyone thought the moment had passed, Blue stood again. Not in panic, not in restlessness, but with intent. Ears perked, eyes locked on the tree line. Alert. Rachel was the first to notice. She stood slowly, her voice low. "Blue?" Blue glanced at her for only a second, one quick, deliberate look, then turned back toward the trees. There was no growl, no bark, but something in that stillness carried urgency. Then it came. A soft sound, almost hidden beneath the rustling leaves. A dry, stifled sob so faint it could have been mistaken for wind. But Blue had already heard it. Seconds later, one of the staff members rushed over with a clipboard. Breathless. "We're missing a child," she said. 8 years old. He's new. He must have wandered off when they were playing catch near the trail." Panic rippled through the group. A parent reached for their phone. Another began shouting the boy's name. But Rachel didn't move. She just looked at Blue. And Blue had already started walking. No command, no signal, just instinct. 1 step, 2. Then a pause, turning back to make sure the others were following. Rachel didn't hesitate. "Follow Blue!" she called out. One by one, the adults and staff fell in behind. Blue didn't run, just moved with quiet purpose. At each fork in the trail, Blue would pause, nose close to the ground, reading every whisper in the dirt, every ghost of movement. Sometimes Blue changed direction, sometimes bolted forward, only to circle back, but never aimless, never lost. Blue was leading. Calm, precise, focused, no drama, no barked alarms, just a silent resolve that everyone behind could feel, like the air had shifted, like something sacred was happening in those quiet woods. And then finally, from behind a thick tree trunk, they saw him, a small, trembling figure curled tight into himself, shoulders quivering in fear. The boy sat with his knees hugged to his chest, face buried deep in the crook of his arms, lips pressed into a line so tight it looked painful. Blue didn't rush, didn't bark or whine, just walked slowly and carefully and stopped a few steps away. No closer, no sound. Just presence. Then something gentle must have pulled at the boy because he lifted his head. His eyes were red, swollen with tears. And in that silent exchange, Blue lowered himself to the ground and simply lay still. The boy hesitated. Then, slowly, almost like reaching out into a dream, he extended one hand and placed it softly between Blue's ears. The touch was feather-light. Not to test, not to pull, just to ask a silent question. "Is it okay if I hold on to you, just for a little while?" Blue didn't flinch, didn't move. His breathing slowed deeper, steadier. The boy's hands still shook, but his body no longer curled away. Rachel and the therapy staff approached, offering gentle reassurance. When they helped the boy to his feet, Blue rose too and walked beside him, shoulder to knee. No leash, no commands. Just there. On the walk back, no one said much. But something had changed in their faces. A kind of quiet awe, because they all knew Blue hadn't just come back that day. Blue had brought someone else back with him, and somehow, that felt more powerful than any schedule, any therapy plan, or any golden badge printed with the word success. But sometimes, the world moves too fast to notice what truly matters. A few days after the outing, Rachel received an email. Brief, just a few lines. Blue's therapy schedule would be suspended pending review of a complaint. A parent had said their child felt uneasy around the dog. No specifics, no incident. Just a vague discomfort. It was enough to trigger every rule in the handbook about psychological safety. Rachel read it once, then again. Not with anger, not even surprised. Just that slow, sinking feeling that something precious had slipped through her fingers, even though she had never tried to grip it tightly in the first place. She folded her phone shut, looked out the window. Blue was lying on the front step, head resting across his front paws. His gaze stretched far into the distance, still and quiet, like he was listening to a sound that humans couldn't hear. Same posture, same calm, not trying to impress, not trying to please, just present at the right time, in the right place. The memory of that final therapy session washed back over her. Blue hadn't jumped on anyone, hadn't wagged frantically or shown off with tricks. He had simply existed. And that was enough for one terrified child to inch forward, to reach out first, to feel safe for the first time in weeks. Because those eyes, they didn't rush, they didn't judge. And yet, because Blue didn't look like the textbook definition of a therapy dog, he had been removed from the very path he was quietly changing for the better. Rachel stepped out onto the porch and sat beside him. "We might have to take a break," she whispered. She didn't look at Blue, just let her hand rest near his shoulder, close enough to feel the warmth. Blue didn't move, but he didn't walk away either. And that right there was her answer. Some souls are not born to shine in a crowd. They are born to show up quietly, precisely, in the one place, at the one time for the one person who needs them most. Blue never needed to wag a tail to be loved. Blue only needed to understand that silence, too, can heal. And sometimes, it's the quiet that echoes loudest inside a human heart. That morning, the rain was soft, almost reluctant, streaking the car windows with long, transparent trails that blurred the world outside into something slow and unspeakably tender. Rachel hadn't planned to go back to the therapy center. After Blue was placed on hold, she'd honored the decision, quietly stepping back. But then came a call that shifted everything. It was Gracie, the program coordinator. Her voice was shaking. "Rachel, there's a little boy. He just lost his sister in an accident. He's locked himself in the therapy room. We can't get through. We need Blue." Rachel didn't ask for details. She didn't hesitate. She simply nodded, turned the wheel on the wet road, and changed direction. In the back seat, Blue sat still, gazing out the window. No anxious pacing, no excitement, just a steady, watchful calm, as if he already knew where they were going and why. When they arrived, the staff was waiting in the hallway, the tension in their posture impossible to miss. "His name is Evan," someone said quietly. "He hasn't spoken, won't let anyone near him. He hasn't eaten since this morning. We're afraid he's shutting down." Rachel opened the car door. Blue stepped down. No one called his name. No one held a leash. No one gave a command. Blue didn't need it. He simply walked beside Rachel like a warm breeze threading through the chill of an April rain. They approached the therapy room. The door stood slightly ajar. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. And Blue, as if knowing what his presence meant, paused at the threshold for a breath. Then stepped in. Soft yellow light spilled across the cold floor as Blue's shadow stretched ahead of him. In the far corner of the room, Evan sat curled into himself, face buried in a tear-soaked pillow, shoulders trembling beneath the weight of everything he could not say. Beside him lay an old, stained, threadbare hoodie, likely the last piece of his sister he had left. No one had touched it. There were no voices, only the soft rhythm of rain on glass. Blue walked forward, slow and measured, and stopped about half a meter from Evan. He sat down. Not a sound. Not a whine. Not a single push for attention. He simply existed. As a second heartbeat in a room full of sorrow. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Rachel held her breath, and then a flicker. A movement so small it might have gone unnoticed. Evan's arm shifted. Slowly, carefully. One fragile finger stretched out from beneath the hoodie and touched Blue's paw. Tentative, shaky, but real. Blue didn't move, didn't flinch. He stayed exactly where he was, like even a shift in breath might scare the moment away. Evan lifted his face. Tears streaked his cheeks. His chest still rose and fell with uneven rhythm, but his eyes finally lifted from the floor. And Blue tilted his head. Just slightly. No claim, no intrusion, just presence. The whole room held its breath. No one moved. Gracie placed a hand on Rachel's shoulder and whispered, voice thick with emotion, "We tried everything. But only Blue got close enough." Rachel didn't respond. She only looked at Blue, still calm and unshaken. A dog without credentials, without special training, without the need to become anything other than what he already was. Blue didn't need to impress the world. Blue just needed to be there, right there, in that moment, for that child. To remind him that someone was still willing to stay. The entire interaction was recorded by the room's security camera. Not for applause, not for proof, but simply to be remembered. Because some things quiet, gentle, and nearly invisible deserve to be seen again. So that maybe we stop overlooking what truly matters. Gracie was the first to bring that recording into the board meeting. No arguments, no long defenses. She simply pressed play, let the video fill the room, and said, quietly but clearly, "I don't know how many training programs it would take to teach a dog to do this, but I do know one thing. If Blue hadn't been there that day, we would have lost that child." The room fell still. Faces that once carried the weight of a parent's complaint now softened into something else, something humbled. They watched Evan's hand reach for Blue, not because anyone told him to, not because he was prompted or coaxed, but because in that moment he had felt safe. A kind of peace that required no instruction, no explanation, just presence, just truth. 3 days later, Rachel received a formal invitation from the center. Not to interrogate her, but to apologize. And more importantly, to rewrite Blue's record, this time not as a temporary therapy trial, but as an official, permanent part of the program. Inside the small meeting room, the center's director, an older man with graying hair and a slow, deliberate voice, slid the new file across the table to Rachel. His eyes held no defensiveness, only clarity. "We were wrong," he said. "Wrong to think Blue had to be like other dogs to be recognized. The truth is, what Blue brings into a room, no training manual can replicate, and no other dog can replace it." Rachel looked down at the paperwork. She didn't sign it right away. She placed her hand over the form, not possessively but gently, and replied with quiet certainty. Blue never needed permission to heal. He just needed to be in the right place, to help someone. There were no standing ovations, no banners, no medals are cast in gold, only silence. But this time, it was the kind of silence that held meaning, the kind that stays, the kind Blue had always carried with him. On the drive home, Blue sat in the back seat, his posture as calm as ever. Rachel didn't look back. But now and then, at red lights, she would reach behind her seat, fingers brushing the top of Blue's head. Not saying anything, not needing to. Because sometimes, a victory doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs to be witnessed. A little girl had smiled after her father's funeral. A small boy had reached out after losing his sister. And now, a center that was once misunderstood had learned to see differently. Not because Blue wagged his tail, not because he performed, but because somewhere, long ago, under the fading light of a parking lot, Blue waited, and kept waiting, until someone sat beside him. And now, he was still doing the same for others. Quietly. Patiently. And finally, without having to ask if he was allowed to stay. Blue still followed Rachel every morning, just like always. Still walked gently behind her steps. Still didn't bark. Still never asked for anything. But something felt different. His pace had slowed. His ears no longer perked up so sharply when the door creaked open. And every time he stood, Blue paused for a few seconds, just to find his balance again. Rachel noticed it, but she told herself it was just the cold weather setting in, or maybe the recent therapy trips had tired Blue out more than usual. Nothing serious. It had to be nothing. That afternoon, in the backyard, Blue curled up under the tree. His old stuffed elephant rested beside him, worn but intact. The breeze drifted through gently, lifting the fur around his neck like soft waves brushing against a memory. Rachel brought him water, placing the bowl near his side without a word. She sat down a few steps away, quietly, on the wooden porch. Blue opened his eyes. That look, it was still Blue, but not quite the same. The sharp spark was dimmer. There was no eager head tilt, no glowing eyes like when Rachel used to grab the leash. Just a look, as if he wanted to say something but didn't know how. Rachel smiled gently, as she always did. Her voice came out in a breath-soft murmur. "Maybe you're just tired, huh? Let's take a day off tomorrow." Blue didn't respond, didn't lift his head. But his eyes stayed on her, patient, and as if he was still trying to explain something in a language only silence knew. When night fell, Rachel laid an extra blanket beside the sofa. Blue walked over but didn't lie down right away. He just stood there for a long moment before finally lowering himself to the floor, letting out a breath that sounded heavier than usual. Rachel lay on her side, her arm slipping off the edge of the couch, fingertips gently resting against Blue's back. "Good night, Blue." Blue didn't move much, just a soft tremble under his thick coat, as though his body was quietly bracing itself, not wanting Rachel to worry. And that night, Rachel stayed awake longer than usual, not because of any sound, not because Blue did anything wrong, but because something inside her was starting to grow quietly, slowly, a feeling she couldn't shake. Something was changing. Something her strong heart, as it had always been, wasn't quite ready to name. Because naming the fear means preparing for what comes next. And Rachel wasn't ready. The next morning, Blue didn't stay curled up like before. When Rachel stood and reached for the leash, then turned back around, Blue tried to stand too. Not quickly, but clearly he was trying. Rachel saw that. She almost said, "Let's stay in today," but stopped herself. Because maybe Blue needed this. Maybe he needed to do what he's always done just one more time. The therapy center was unusually quiet that day. No laughter, no whispering conversations. A few kids sat grouped by the window, eyes dull with exhaustion. In the corner of the room, a little girl curled into an armchair, facing the wall. She wasn't crying, but her body felt like it had sunk into a thick silence. One of the therapists whispered to Rachel, "Her mom passed away last night. We're not sure if she understands, or if she's just shut the world out." Blue stepped into the room. Didn't look around, didn't approach anyone else. He walked slowly toward the corner toward the girl. No sound, no bark, no effort to be noticed like other dogs might do. Blue just stopped about half a meter away, then sat down. The old stuffed elephant still hung gently in his mouth. That little toy Blue had never parted from it, not once, since the first day Rachel found him. He took it everywhere, as if it carried a piece of a memory he never wanted to lose. And then, slowly, Blue placed the elephant down, pushed it gently toward the girl, then stepped back a little. He didn't expect anything, didn't ask to be touched, he just left it there. As if he understood some wounds can only be soothed by things that were once deeply loved. The entire room fell still. A few staff members brought trembling hands to their mouths. Rachel stood by the door, eyes stinging. She had never taught Blue to do that. Never told him that today might be the last time they'd come here. But somehow, Blue knew. The little girl still hadn't turned around. But one small finger peeked out from the sleeve of her oversized sweater and timidly pulled the stuffed elephant closer. She didn't hug it, didn't bury her face in it. She just held it softly in her palm like a gift sent from somewhere far, far away. And then, in a moment so fragile no one dared breathe, something happened. So delicate it had no name. Her shoulder trembled. A muffled sob escaped, and a single tear fell onto the back of the old, faded elephant. Blue didn't move, didn't step forward. He just stayed there watching, then gently closed his eyes, as if saying, silently and completely, "My work here is done." And Rachel for the first time felt her heart break, not from pain, but from the deep, humbling knowledge that in all the days behind them, Blue had always known how to love, in the simplest, most profound way one living being could ever love another. The car pulled away from the center quietly that afternoon. The sunlight spilled golden and soft across the road, catching the tips of swaying leaves in a warm, honey-like glow. But no one in the car spoke. No praise. No questions. Just silence, as if the whole world had agreed to hold still for the moment that had just passed. Blue lay in the back seat. No longer rests his chin on the window like he used to. He didn't watch the cars. Didn't perk up at the voices of children calling his name. He just lay there neatly, quietly, as if trying to keep the weight of what just happened from unraveling too fast. Rachel turned on the radio. A quiet, wordless piano piece filled the car, the same one they used to listen to on long, open road drives. She glanced at the rearview mirror. Blue hadn't moved. But then, just barely. Blue tilted his head, slow, gentle, as if he still recognized the music. And then, carefully, Blue pressed up with his legs, just a little, just enough to lean forward and rest his head against Rachel's shoulder from behind the driver's seat. It was the softest touch. No pressure, no urgency, but enough for Rachel to feel the warmth that still lingered. And from deep within her throat, a sound escaped low and rough, like someone holding back tears at the edge of their voice. "You chose to give," Rachel whispered, her hand gently brushing the velvet soft ear now resting on her shoulder. "Now it's my turn, to learn how to let go." There was no reply, and none was needed, because beside her Blue remained, not trying to soothe the pain, not denying what was coming, just being there, just as he always had, loving in the only way he knew how, quietly and at exactly the right moment. As the car turned down the narrow street that led home, Rachel caught a glimpse in the rear-view mirror. There on the second floor of the therapy center stood the little girl. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just stood there, silent, holding the blue stuffed elephant close to her chest. Her eyes followed the car through the sunlight, as if trying to hold on to the last flicker of warmth from the creature who had left behind the most precious part of himself. And Rachel understood. That little girl, though she hadn't spoken a word, was learning, too. Learning how to hold on to a love that didn't need to be named. The car slowed as they neared home. A breeze drifted through the window, carrying with it the scent of fresh grass and late-day sun. Blue shivered slightly. Not from cold, but perhaps just to let Rachel know he was still there. Still here in every breath that now came slower, softer. And for Rachel, every passing second had begun to feel eternal. Rachel tilted her head slightly, eyes drifting toward the still form beside her. She placed her hand gently on Blue's back, softly, almost afraid to disturb the ache buried deep in those tired muscles that were slowly letting go. And then, from somewhere in her chest, warmth bloomed. It wasn't pain. It wasn't fear. It was something else, a quiet kind of acceptance, even if her heart wasn't ready to say the word. A few days earlier, Rachel had asked the center if they could hold a small farewell gathering for Blue, not a big event, just something intimate. A moment for the children who had once sat with Blue, who had rested their hands on his steady back, who had once locked eyes with that calm, patient gaze, to say goodbye. But this morning, when Rachel called softly to wake Blue, he didn't rise right away like usual. It took a moment, a slow, heavy turn of his body, a single step that came with effort. His eyes were still kind, still steady, still fixed on her, but this time they seemed to say, "Let's go, just slowly today." Rachel picked up the phone and called the center. One of the coordinators, someone who had watched Blue closely over the past months, said nothing for a moment, then spoke softly. "Maybe it's time we let Blue rest, so he won't have to spend his last strength trying to give it all away." No one used the word goodbye. No one said it last time. But Rachel knew. Every minute slipping by now was fragile, irreplaceable, and thin as breath. She didn't speak. She just sat beside Blue and pulled a sheet of paper from the drawer. There weren't any prepared words, just lines that flowed, letter by letter, from trembling fingers, a quiet attempt to hold on to something before it scattered like ash in the wind. "Dear Blue, if this is the last time we get to sit together, I just want to say thank you. Not for helping anyone, not for changing anyone, but for staying, for waiting, for being quietly present beside those who thought the world had forgotten them. You never needed applause. You never needed a spotlight. Just a small place, beside someone who needed you right when they needed you most." Rachel folded the letter and slipped it into a small wooden box, the one where she kept the little things Blue had once held dear. An old piece of silk scarf, a worn-down name tag, and a few Polaroid snapshots of sunlit moments and quiet company. She didn't call Blue over. She didn't coax him to lie down. She simply sat. Just as Blue had once done for her on a distant, lonely afternoon in that forgotten parking lot. Outside, sunlight slanted through the trees. There was no farewell gathering today, no ceremony. But in that small house, a woman was learning to say goodbye not with tears, but with presence, fully, silently, completely. The door didn't knock, but soft footsteps echoed through the hallway. A boy in a red shirt appeared first. In his hands, a crumpled drawing colored with pencils, uneven and messy but unmistakable. A dog cradling a blue elephant, standing beside a smiling child. He placed it on the table, beside a glass of wilted flowers that had begun to droop but still stood. Immediately after, a little girl with shoulder-length hair walked in, clutching a worn teddy bear tightly to her chest. She didn't speak. She simply placed a folded piece of paper at the corner of the table. On it, written in slanted, uneven handwriting, were the words, "I'm not afraid of the dark anymore, because Blue sat with me through a rainy night." Rachel stood behind the doorway. She didn't step out. But each word, each offering, they dropped softly into her heart, like water falling over stone, gentle, repeating, until even stone remembers what it means to feel. The third child arrived later. It was the boy who had once gotten lost in the woods. He came empty-handed, just stood there, back straight, eyes steady, facing the quiet space ahead. And then, with a voice slow but certain, he said, "If Blue hadn't come back for me that day, I think I'd still be in the forest." He didn't bow, he didn't smile. But in his eyes, clear and shimmering, was the purest kind of gratitude. The last person to arrive, the most unexpected of all, was an adult. A parent. The very one who had once written a letter demanding Blue be removed from the program, claiming their son felt intimidated. But today, that same person stepped forward, voice trembling yet steady. "I was wrong, deeply wrong, because not everyone who speaks loudly is safe, and not everyone who is quiet should be feared. Blue listens, Blue waits, and Blue loves in ways many grown-ups have never learned to." The room fell into silence again. One of the center's staff, the same person who had recorded the therapy session, quietly approached the director's desk. They didn't speak, just opened the video, letting everyone watch the moment a dog placed his own old toy beside a child who had just lost her mother, and waited. Didn't ask for it back, didn't look for praise, just stayed. That same afternoon, the board gathered. No dramatic announcements, no press release, just a quiet meeting, honest and thoughtful. And at the end, a proposal was made, a memorial plaque to honor Blue. Not because Blue had succeeded, but because Blue had shown up at the right time, in the right way, in a way no one else ever could. Only then did Rachel step forward. No white coat today, no clipboard, no charts, just herself, eyes tired but clear. She didn't smile, didn't nod. She simply said softly, "Blue doesn't need to be honored. Only remembered by those who were ever touched by him." And from somewhere deep within the quiet house, a breath rose soft, faint, but unmistakable. Blue was still listening, still there, present in the silence that had always done more healing than words ever could. Rachel gently wrapped her arms around Blue, lifting him the way one might carry a sleeping child. This was the same dog who had once curled up in the cold corner of a grocery cart, forgotten and nearly frozen. But now Blue was being carried home, not as a rescue, not as a case, but as family. No paperwork, no applause, just a warm embrace, and the sound of a heart still beating out of love. The car rolled forward slowly, as if Rachel was trying to stretch every second left with Blue beside her. No one spoke. The windows were half open, and the breeze carried the scent of dry grass and late-season sunlight. Blue didn't move, but his head leaned toward Rachel the same way it always had, as if to say, "I'm still here." Back in the small town where Blue had once been abandoned, an anonymous letter arrived at the local authorities' office. No name, no signature, just photographs, documents, and timestamps, and one quiet note scrawled at the bottom, "Not for revenge, but so there will never be another Blue left behind." The man who once ran the illegal breeding kennel, Troy Haskins, was now under formal investigation. People who had once remained silent began to speak up. Forgotten files were reopened. A young female officer, reviewing a case folder, glanced up at her partner and whispered, "Was he the therapy dog? Blue?" She nodded to herself. "Then this time, we don't miss anyone." Rachel did not take part in the investigation. She didn't tell many stories about Blue's past, but somehow the story found its way out, as if old wounds, when touched at the right time, could become reminders. Protect before you have to save. At home, Rachel laid a soft blanket over the couch near the window. She placed Blue down gently, the way someone sets down something too precious to ever lose. There were no more reassurances, no more hopeful guesses. Just a quiet truth. Blue was staying for his final days. The sunset light angled through the wooden window frame. The sun seemed to linger, a little slower than usual. Like it, too, didn't want to leave someone behind. Blue lay curled, his head resting on Rachel's lap. His eyes were no longer sharp, but they still followed her every motion. No words were needed, no explanations, just presence. Rachel didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't even say his name. She simply leaned forward, resting her forehead against Blue's. And in the fading breath of the day, she whispered, "Thank you for staying." It wasn't a goodbye. It was a greeting for a soul that had once been discarded, yet somehow found his way back home. Truly home. And then, on a morning that seemed no different from any other, with the sunlight filtering softly through the curtains just like it always had, Rachel woke with the distinct sensation that something had slipped from her chest. The room was unchanged. The warmth still hung in the air. But something familiar, something essential, was missing. There were no gentle claw clicks across the floor, no quiet stretching near the bed, no loyal eyes tracking her every move like they held the whole world inside. Rachel stepped out of her room, each footfall like drifting into a dream where sorrow had yet to find its name. Her heart knew before her mind could accept it. And there, in the corner of the living room, beside her own worn shoes, she saw it. The blue stuffed elephant, neatly placed, too carefully placed to be accidental. As if Blue somehow had chosen to leave in the gentlest way he could, without waking her, without a final breath, just quietly, leaving behind the thing he loved most, like a wordless hug. Rachel dropped to her knees. Her hands trembled as she lifted the toy to her chest. And in that fragile weight, she felt the full journey from the cold grocery cart where she first found him to the moment she gave him a name, to the first time he let her touch his back, to the smiles he had given children after loss. It all rushed in, tangled, whole, and this time, Rachel didn't hold back. She cried, truly cried, not from surprise, not even fully from grief, but because, for the first time, she understood some goodbyes don't need to be spoken. They don't need flowers or a gathering of mourners. Sometimes, a dog who had once been thrown away chooses to stay, and when he finally goes, he still leaves you with the gentlest message, "I never left you behind." And Rachel, in that familiar room, wrapped in quiet morning light, sat there for a long time, holding the stuffed elephant to her chest as tears slid down, one by one. Not because she was weak, but because Blue had taught her that love sometimes is just presence and light, even when the one who brought it is no longer here. The air around her was still, but inside her heart, every sound of memory became louder than ever. The soft breath beside the couch each night, the morning pause echoing across the kitchen tiles, and above all, the silence. The silence Blue had once used to heal a room full of children. And Rachel herself. She lifted her gaze, looking out the window where the sunlight still poured in like a habit that had never once broken. And there, in that fragile stream of golden breath, Rachel softly said Blue's name, not to be heard, not to call him back, but simply to keep hold of something that was never meant to fade. In her hands rested the little blue elephant, worn, frayed, aged by time, but carrying within it the most complete love one soul could leave for another. And in that moment, Rachel understood maybe not all love needs words. Not all promises need to be spoken aloud. Sometimes, all it takes is presence long enough, quiet enough, and real enough to be called home. That afternoon, at the center where Blue had walked so many halls, a quiet gathering took place. No altar, no portrait, No black ribbons, no scripted farewells, just a softly lit room, filled with those who had once been touched by Blue's quiet healing, even if only once. The center's board had told Rachel, "We don't know what to call this, but it feels like everyone needs to be here." And they were right. One by one, children arrived. Parents, therapists, no rushing, no explanations. But each person held something small and blue: a scarf, a keychain, a pencil box, a stuffed toy. Old or new, it was as if they had planned it together, but no messages had been sent, no invitations issued. In the corner of the room, a young girl sat cross-legged, silent. In front of her was a pale blue stuffed elephant, not the same one Blue had carried, but astonishingly similar. A staff member leaned down gently and asked, "Would you like to write something? Maybe a memory?" The girl shook her head slowly, then exhaled. "I don't know what to write, so I'm just sitting here, like Blue used to do with me." The room fell completely silent. Not the silence of discomfort, not the silence of ceremony, but something deeper. A stillness that didn't need tears or trumpets. A quiet that stretched into hearts and settled there. Rachel stood near the window, holding a worn leather notebook, the same one where she used to document Blue's sessions with the children. Each page is sewn together with memory. Now, she no longer wrote. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because every quiet look, every unspoken gesture in this room had already written the rest. One former staff member finally spoke, barely above a whisper. Blue never said anything, but he was never absent. And so the gathering continued. No official end, no final word. People came, lingered, then left, each one leaving their small blue item in the corner. As the sunlight shifted and cast long shadows across the floor, the space grew full not with things, but with something warmer, something whole. The feeling of hearts being quietly made whole again. Rachel remained after the last had gone. She didn't tidy up, didn't collect the offerings into neat piles. She just sat there still as Blue had once sat beside her on that very first morning. No one called his name, but somehow, everyone had come back, because silence, when filled with meaning, had never echoed louder. And on the wooden table, between unopened letters and folded notes, lay one slip of paper scrawled by Rachel weeks ago. Back when Blue still lay by the front steps each morning, his head resting near the door, his eyes fixed on the dirt path leading out of town. The paper was crinkled at the corners, the ink slightly smudged. But the words were still there, soft, simple, and entirely unremarkable to anyone who hadn't known Blue. It read, "If one day you're not at the door, I'll still look anyway. Because love, once it finds a place, waits there even after the footsteps are gone." Rachel didn't remember writing it. Not exactly, but she remembered the feeling. That quiet ache of knowing something beautiful can't stay forever, and loving it all the more because of that. She sat there until the room dimmed with evening, until the last child's drawing fluttered in the breeze, until the scent of sunlight on wood turned to the cool hush of night. She didn't cry, not this time. Because grief, when honored with presence, doesn't always wear tears. She reached out and laid the blue elephant on the table beside the note. Then turned and gently closed the door behind her, not to shut Blue out, but to let everything he left behind settle, like dust made of light. Outside, the stars blinked open one by one, as if the sky itself had paused to listen. And somewhere where silence holds the shape of love long after it's gone, Blue was still there, waiting, and home had never felt closer. Silence can sometimes produce the most profound scars instead of violence, blamed before we have a chance to speak, by leaving without even saying goodbye. Blue did not cry out to get attention, never made a demand for justice. He only waited for someone who never returned. Rachel also noticed a reflection of something that many of us have experienced: suspicion, missing the mark, holding the pieces together without ever learning the truth. If you have been there and are viewing this, suspected without evidence, accused without justification, if you are left wondering whether your quiet was interpreted as guilt or whether your trust was misplaced, let Blue's story serve as a reminder that you do not need to prove yourself to people who have never seen it. You do not need to go after people who left. All you can do is maintain your composure. Put your truth in writing. Keep your messages safe. If children are involved, use presence rather than rage to protect them. And please ask for aid if you need it, whether it be legal, emotional, or spiritual. It is not shame, it is power. Due to the fact that allegiance is not always uniformed. At times, it simply waits while sitting in a shopping cart with a ripped blue elephant. We would like to hear from you now. Have you ever received an incorrect accusation? Did you suspect someone who was later proven innocent? Leave a comment with your tale. It might be necessary for someone down there to hear that they are not alone. Snow fell like powdered chalk across the wide glass panes of Marlow Ridge Airport, a quiet transfer hub nestled deep in the northern Montana mountains. It was mid-March, but the cold still cut sharply, carving every breath into mist. On the runway, wind tore through rows of frost-covered pines, sweeping snow in slanted flurries like torn pages of letters never finished. Inside the main terminal, everything moved with the weary rhythm of a snowstorm morning. Delayed flights, travelers checking their watches in silence, and the bitter scent of burnt coffee mixing with the tired voice of delay announcements echoing from above. Aegis, a deep-coated German shepherd tinged with russet, moved beside Officer Clara Jensen with the calm precision of a clock wound tight. At over 5 years old, Aegis wasn't trained to sniff out drugs or explosives. He was part of a special behavior detection program, trained not to smell things, but people. Anxiety, deception. Clara gently tightened the leash. Her gloved hand felt the cold seep through the thick patrol jacket. Montana cold didn't care how long you'd been on the job. She was used to patrol duty, but something today wouldn't let her relax. A subtle instinct, sharp and quiet, like the storm wasn't just outside. Aegis continued, steps measured, head lowered slightly, ears alert, level 1 vigilance, until the bark came. One bark, sharp, ripping through the stillness. Then a second, longer, fiercer. Aegis froze, body taut like a drawn bow, his amber eyes locked onto Gate 5, where a line of passengers was calmly moving through screening. Clara followed his gaze. In the crowd stood a woman, tall, graceful. A tailored ash-gray coat, a white silk scarf, pointed black heels. One arm wrapped around a bundled infant, swaddled in a sea-green blanket. The child was perfectly still, head resting on the woman's shoulder, face buried in fabric. But that perfect stillness was what stopped Clara. Aegis moved ahead, growling low. Not the restless whine of boredom, but the deep, guttural warning of instinct ignited. Clara felt her spine coil. She'd survived things logic couldn't explain, and she knew. Aegis never misread a signal. "What is it, partner?" Clara whispered, one hand steady on the leash, the other pressing into her earpiece. No alarms, no alerts, but a few passengers nearby were already turning at the sound of the bark. The woman kept walking, face composed, untouched. Her makeup was flawless, her steps elegant, her eyes forward, cold. When Aegis blocked her path, she paused, bending slightly as if to avoid disturbing the baby. "Is something wrong, officer?" she asked gently, her voice flowing like still water. Clara stood in front of her, eyes locked on the child. In over 10 years working special investigation, she had never seen a newborn lie that still. No twitching feet, no shifting arms, no blink. It wasn't sleep, it was silence wrapped in cotton. The wrong kind of silence. "I'm sorry, ma'am. This is a working dog. He's reacting to something irregular," Clara said, voice calm but resolute. "Irregular?" The woman raised an eyebrow, clutching the child tighter. "I'm just catching a flight. We're headed to Seattle." Clara tilted her head slightly. "Seattle?" she repeated. "I was informed all Seattle-bound flights were canceled this morning due to the low-pressure system." The woman paused. "Oh, I meant Portland. I'm exhausted. My baby just recovered from a cold." Aegis growled again. Sharper. Firm. He lowered his body, front legs braced, tail tucked, a stance trained to intercept. Clara knew she couldn't wait any longer. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me. We'll just verify some information. It won't take long." The space around them tensed. The woman hesitated, then turned slightly. "I've done nothing wrong. My child is sleeping and you're scaring him." "That's the thing," Clara said softly. "Since the beginning, your baby hasn't reacted at all." The woman stopped. Completely still. Clara didn't draw her weapon, didn't raise her voice. She simply signaled to Aegis, and together they began moving toward the temporary holding room. But just then, a figure pushed through the gathering crowd. An old woman, her silver hair neatly pinned under a wool hat, cheeks red from the cold, hands trembling as she held a worn folder. "His name is Micah," she whispered. "He's my grandson. That baby, he's mine." The woman holding the child spun around, eyes wide. She clutched the bundle closer, protective instinct flaring. Aegis stepped forward, tall, unwavering, completely blocking the path. He didn't bark, but his stare silenced everything. Clara moved in. Beneath the brewing chaos, she felt something deeper begin to stir. Something far larger than one child. And whatever it was, it had just begun. The temporary holding room at Marlow Ridge Airport was designed to ease tension. Warm lights glowed softly over dark wooden floors. A one-way glass wall reflected daylight from the outside, but let no gaze pass through. Inside, Aegis stood unmoving, like a living bronze statue, his gaze locked onto the woman holding the infant. The woman placed her genuine leather bag on the chair, voice calm and measured. "My name is Lana Marin," she said, holding the swaddled baby close against her chest. "We're flying to Seattle, early flight. I don't understand why we're being detained." Clara stood across from her, eyes never leaving the child in the woman's arms. Though the room wasn't cold, the baby's cheeks looked pale. He didn't stir, didn't react to sounds. No stretches, no twitching fingers, none of the restless motions that newborns made. He looked still, as if time had been drawn out of him. "You said Seattle?" Clara repeated, her tone composed but subtly firmer. One hand hovered near the terminal scanner. "All Seattle flights were canceled at 6:10 this morning due to a tropical depression. The system was updated across the airport. Are you certain?" Lana offered a practiced smile, the kind worn by people used to controlling the narrative. "Maybe I misspoke. I meant Portland. I'm very tired. This trip, it's been long and stressful." Clara gave a slow nod. Aegis growled again. Quiet, but compressed, like pressure building behind a dam. He had been trained not to cause panic. But when he growled like that, it meant the threshold had been crossed. Clara stepped toward the inspection table. "I'll need to see your ID, boarding pass, and, if possible, any documentation for the child. Birth certificate or guardianship papers." "I already said, the boarding pass is digital. My ID is in my wallet, and the baby's documents are in the checked luggage." Lana's arms tightened around the child. "Then let me see your boarding pass." Lana fumbled in her purse, scrolled through her phone, then glanced up. "Sorry, the signal's weak. App won't load." Clara remained silent for a few seconds. In that stillness, a soft shifting sound came from the corner, not from Lana, but from Aegis. The dog moved forward, just one step, lowering his neck, eyes widening, not in caution, in warning. "May I take a closer look at the baby?" Clara asked gently, lowering her voice to avoid escalating the tension. Lana took a half step back. "He's sleeping. I don't want to wake him. But if there's any health concern, we need to check immediately." Their eyes locked. On one side, practiced calm with a chill beneath. On the other, seasoned instinct that did not back down. And between them, Aegis, the bridge made of trust and primal sense. Just then the door opened. Lieutenant Monroe stepped in, holding a fresh printout from the flight coordination desk. "Clara," he said, "all flights to Seattle and Portland have been canceled since early morning. Confirmed by all three carriers, Northwest Sky, Rainbird, and Air West." Clara took the sheet, flipped it over. "You're sure your name is Lana Marin?" she asked, eyes narrowing. "I've already told you," Lana snapped, the steadiness in her voice beginning to crack. "If there's an issue with the flight, I can call my husband. He's waiting for us in Seattle." Clara's gaze shifted to the child. "I'll need to confirm the baby's name, birth date, and your relationship to him. This isn't bureaucracy. It's for safety." Aegis suddenly stepped forward. No bark, no jump, just one deliberate step, yet every hair along his spine stood on end. Clara understood. This was no longer about routine verification. "Ms. Lana," she said slowly, "we are within legal bounds to hold you for identity confirmation if there is reasonable suspicion. And right now, my canine partner is showing a direct response to the child you're holding. I need to verify his identity." "Are you accusing me of kidnapping my own child?" Lana burst out, her voice rising. "No one said that." Clara's tone stayed even. "But I'm trained to trust the things we can't always see." Aegis let out a bark, short, sharp, heavy with gravity. The child still did not move. A side door opened. A young officer stepped in, breath quick, eyes wide. "Officer Jensen, urgent update from Belridge PD. A 2-year-old boy, named Micah Nolan, has been missing for 3 days. A MBER alert just went out. Last seen with a woman matching the security camera footage we received." Clara turned instantly. Her hand trembled slightly. She looked at the baby in Lana's arms, and suddenly realized those tiny legs had not moved once since they entered the room. "We need to take the child to medical evaluation immediately," Clara ordered. "You can't!" Lana shouted. Aegis barked again, this time not a warning, a command. And in that moment, Clara felt the world around her blur into silence until only 3 images remained. A motionless child, still as wax. A woman unraveling at the seams, and a dog standing firm on the last line between a mother and something far darker. The airport intercom drifted lazily across the ceiling, its announcements of delayed flights echoing like a vague soundtrack to something far greater unraveling inside the holding room. But Clara Jensen no longer heard any of it. Not the smell of burnt coffee, not the rumble of suitcase wheels, only Aegis, standing firmly before the woman who claimed to be Lana Marin, and the child who still hadn't moved in her arms. For a moment, everything froze. until the radio clipped to Clara's shoulder crackled to life with a gravelly tone. "Jensen, this is command. Have you received the AMBER alert from Belridge PD?" Clara stiffened. Her hand went to the radio. "Not yet. Send it over." Keystrokes clacked on the other end. Then a female voice spoke, swift, professional. 2-year-old boy, name Micah Nolan, missing for 3 days from Belridge. Last seen at a playground near a preschool with an adult female, black hair, approximately 5 feet 7 inches, gray coat, white scarf, black shoes. Description matches the woman currently in holding room 4. Clara gripped the leash tighter. Aegis didn't blink. His growl deepened. Then, without shifting his focus, he took a single step back, opening a path but not relaxing. The child remained silent, faint pink in his cheeks, dark curls soft around his temples, but no stir, no awareness, a silence too complete. "Lana Marin," Clara spoke again, this time no longer asking. "You are now required to cooperate and bring the child for medical evaluation. This is no longer optional." The woman clutched the boy tighter. "You're violating the law. I haven't been charged with anything." "No one's charging you," Clara replied calmly, "but I'm authorized to detain you if there's reasonable cause to believe a child may be in danger. And this dog," she nodded at Aegis, "doesn't make mistakes." Aegis barked, loud, sharp. It rang off the glass like a gavel striking down. A security officer entered quickly through the side door, followed by a female medic. "We have a separate exam room, soundproof with biometric monitors and vital sign tracking," the medic said. Clara nodded. "Take us there." Lana didn't resist, but in her eyes, Clara saw something strange, not fear, but fracture. A kind of psychological dissonance, as if Lana herself was lost inside the very story she had created. The medical evaluation room lay at the far end of a quiet hallway, far from the public terminals. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic. The ceiling lights glowed warm against pale green walls. Lana was seated on a cushioned chair next to the exam table. Clara pulled on latex gloves and stepped forward. "This will be a simple preliminary check," she said gently. "If the child is yours, everything will be fine. If not, you'll need to prove it with even greater clarity." Lana said nothing. She stared at Clara, the cool control of earlier moments fading fast. Behind her eyes, something cracked, like a mask beginning to splinter. Aegis sat by the table, silent, watching. Clara crouched, carefully lifting the sea-green blanket from the child's neck. Her motions were gentle, non-invasive, but as the fabric shifted, a tiny mark came into view. Behind the child's left ear, a thin scar, faint and narrow, unmistakably shaped like a dog bite from early infancy, glinted beneath the light. Clara drew in a breath. She remembered the alert. Micah Nolan, small scar behind the left ear from a family dog accident at 13 months old. That could not be coincidence. At that very moment, the hallway door opened. An elderly woman entered, short, frail, bundled in a thick scarf. Her face was lined with worry and sleepless nights. Her hands trembled as she carried a folder and a worn, plastic-laminated photo. "Florence Nolan," she said, her voice shaking. I'm Micah's grandmother. I was told the child might be here." Clara straightened, then nodded. "We do have a child under evaluation. But to confirm, we need you to provide specific identifying details. Is there anything unique you can tell us?" Florence didn't hesitate. "Micah has a small scar behind his left ear, from an accident with our dog Murphy when he was just 13 months old. He also twists the corner of his blanket when he sleeps, and he always tilts his head to the right when he hears his mother's voice." Clara led her to the one-way viewing window. Aegis turned his head toward Florence, as if listening too. Florence placed her hand against the glass. "Micah." My boy, she whispered. That's him, that's really him. When Clara opened the door to the exam room, the air inside grew dense. Florence stepped forward, tears streaming. She didn't need to touch him. She didn't need to call his name. She simply looked, and she knew. This was the child she had rocked to sleep. The baby she had cradled for 2 full years. The child she had whispered for in tears over 3 endless days. Micah, she murmured, and the boy, though still unconscious, tilted his head slightly to the right. Aegis let out a sound. Not a growl, not a bark, just a soft, low whine, deep and warm, like the breath of spring melting through snow. The medical wing at Marlow Ridge Airport had shifted into emergency status. Micah, the 2-year-old boy just identified, lay on the examination table, wires connected to his chest and arms. Monitors tracked his heartbeat and blood pressure, the numbers flashing gently in hues of green and blue. Tension flickered with every pulse on the screen. Clara stood beside the attending ER physician, a calm, seasoned Asian man named Dr. Victor Juan. No visible bruising or surface injury, Dr. Juan reported. However, his pupil reflex is delayed. Breathing is light and steady. He's unresponsive, but not comatose, almost like a deep, induced sleep. Medication? Clara asked. He nodded. Possibly high-dose antihistamines or a mild sedative, but we'll need a blood test to be certain. Aegis lay beside the exam table, head resting between his front paws, eyes locked on the boy. Every time the heart monitor skipped or wavered, his ears twitched, and a low, soft whine escaped from deep in his throat. He hasn't left the child's side since the first encounter, Clara said quietly. It's like he knows what needs protecting. Victor nodded. Dogs feel in ways we don't measure, especially a German shepherd like Aegis. Their instincts cut deeper than any machine. The door opened. A young nurse entered, holding a printout of the passport and ID retrieved from Lana Marin's wallet. Basic info checks out. Lana Marin, 33 years old, listed residence on Brighton Avenue, outskirts of Belridge, no criminal record, but what? Clara looked up. In her medical file from Belridge Central Hospital, she was admitted for psychiatric care 2 years ago. 6-week inpatient program. Referred to a facility called the Kinvale Institute. Clara frowned. That name hadn't appeared in any official law enforcement database in Montana. She opened her internal police system on her phone. Kinvale? No official website, no press records, but a footnote buried deep in a 2021 investigative report mentioned the Kinvale Institute as a facility for emotional reconnection therapy for grieving parents. Clara turned to Victor. Is Micah in any danger? Not immediately, he said. If it was a low dose, IV fluids and observation should be enough. But if there's any long-acting suppressant in his system, we'll need to transfer him to a full pediatric unit. Clara nodded. I'll take it from here. Lana sat in the adjacent interview room, not hunched, not weeping. She sat upright, chin lifted, fingers interlaced on the table, as if she were the one conducting the interview, not being questioned. Clara entered, leaving Aegis lying silently just outside the door, like a sentry that didn't need orders. You know why I need to speak with you again, Clara began. Lana said nothing. The boy, Micah Nolan, is not your son. Lana blinked. No panic, no denial, just as if she'd heard someone mention a stranger's name. He shows signs of chemical sedation. Were you aware of that? That's my child, Lana said, her voice surfacing for the first time. I know him better than anyone else. He has a birth certificate, legal guardians, a history, and memories you can't fabricate. Lana lowered her head slightly. A faint smile curved at the edge of her mouth. You don't understand. I didn't steal him. I was bringing him home. Clara leaned forward. Home where? To his true spirit. Silence stretched across the room like a rip down its center. Clara spoke slowly. I know you were once a patient at the Kinvale Institute. I also know that place wasn't a typical medical facility. Lana looked up, and in that moment, her eyes unfocused, as if recalling something that had never been completely real to begin with. They showed me, Charlie, she whispered. They told me my son's soul had returned. But not in the same body. A different child. Same birthday, same eyes, same energy. I had to find him. I had to bring him back before the memory faded. Clara felt her spine chill. Who is Charlie? My son, Lana replied, her voice breaking. He died, in an accident, 3 years ago, but I never stopped hearing him cry. Clara slid a file across the table. Charlie died in February. Micah was born in November that same year. The timelines don't match. They said, the soul doesn't follow time, Lana murmured. It follows intent. The room grew heavy with silence. Outside the door, Aegis let out a soft whimper. Clara turned her head. The dog had risen to its feet, sensing something in Lana's voice that shifted the air. Do you know who runs Kinvale? Clara asked. Who brought you there? Lana stared at her hands, so tightly clasped the nails dug into skin. They had no names, just a voice, a man's voice. He didn't heal, he opened doors. What kind of doors? The door between memory and delusion. Snow had begun to fall again as Clara drove away from Marlow Ridge Airport. Night had settled over the town, and soft flakes dotted the windshield like whispers of memory brushing against glass. Aegis sat in the back seat, head gently leaning against the window, his gaze reflecting the amber glow of streetlights. No one spoke. But between human and dog, there are moments that need no words. They simply sat, side by side, letting silence speak the truths both had come to understand. Clara's thoughts drifted to the first time she met Aegis. It was in a small town near Montana's western border. The summer of fire tore through the outskirts. It started with a gas leak in a mobile home tucked near the edge of the woods, less than 300 meters from the highway. By the time first responders arrived, the structure had collapsed into a cage of warped metal, smoke curling thick through the pine air, and the acrid scent of burning plastic tangled with something far more human. Everyone believed nothing could have survived. Until one firefighter spotted a pair of eyes. Buried in the rubble, hidden beneath scorched boards, was a puppy, maybe 3 months old, curled beside the lifeless body of an elderly woman. His face was caked in soot, fur singed across his left flank. But his eyes were wide open. Not terrified, not wild. Guarding. He didn't flee, didn't howl, didn't bite. He simply lay there, in the ash and the ruin, keeping watch over the last piece of his family. They brought him to the local rescue shelter, naming him Aegis, after the mythic Greek shield that stood for unwavering protection. No one believed he'd survive the night. Second-degree burns, respiratory damage, malnourishment. But something in Aegis refused to let go. He didn't whimper, didn't flinch at needles or scalpels. He just kept those eyes, the ones that had watched fire, watched death, and now watched the hands trying to save him. 2 years later, during a specialized evaluation by the Montana Department of Justice, Aegis ranked among the top 4 canines in human behavior recognition. Not trained to sniff out drugs or bombs, Aegis was selected for a pilot program called Project Insight, designed to assess dogs with an uncanny ability to detect deception, danger, and emotional disturbance. At his first assessment trial, Aegis stunned the evaluators. While two other dogs tracked the perfume on a kidnapped child, Aegis locked onto the man claiming to be her father. He growled, refused to leave. And when the man broke eye contact with Clara, Aegis lunged, not to harm, but to block his path. Further investigation revealed the man was a psychological con artist, previously implicated in falsifying kinship claims to traffic children overseas. From that day forward, Aegis wasn't just a tool, he was Clara's partner. Now, back in the present, Clara pulled over at a clearing near the Marlow Forest outpost. Aegis stepped out, stretching slowly. Snow landed softly on his back, but he didn't shiver. He circled once, scanning the terrain, not marking territory, but reading it, like always. Clara sat on the wooden steps near the station cabin and called him over. Aegis didn't rush. He walked steadily to her side, sat close, and rested his head against her knee, as if he too knew this one had been different. Clara ran her hand gently between his ears, her gaze lost in the quiet dark beyond the trees. "Do you still remember the smell of smoke?" she asked softly. Aegis didn't react, but his tail thumped once against the wooden floor, not in joy, but as an answer. "This time," Clara whispered, "the fire wasn't from burning homes. It came from people who set fire to memory, and called it therapy." Aegis tilted his head. His eyes locked with hers. "We have to stop them." The wind slipped cold through the seams of her coat. Aegis leaned into her just a little more. "You once pulled a child from the ashes," she murmured. "Now it's time to pull another, from delusion." The words had barely left her lips when Aegis rose. No bark, no growl, just a subtle shift. Shoulders squared, neck extended, eyes fixed toward the dark beyond the trees. As if, somewhere out there, a new trail had just opened. Night in Marlow Ridge wasn't like anywhere else. It wasn't brilliant, it wasn't bleak, it was just quiet. So quiet that even the wind rustling through the pine branches could startle you if you weren't ready. But tonight, Clara Jensen knew. Quiet didn't mean safe. Somewhere behind a gate that bore all the legal hallmarks, a whole world of memory might be getting rewritten. Kinvale. The name flickered in her mind like a silent alarm. Sleek, cold, and eerily trace-free. She had searched through dozens of treatment centers before, from private psychiatric hospitals to trauma therapy institutes. But none had left such a suspiciously faint digital footprint as Kinvale. No official website, no public staff directory, no published clinical studies in any peer-reviewed journal. All Kinvale offered was a recycled line of copy, a sanctuary for emotional restoration, helping grieving parents reconnect with the soul and rediscover the continuity of love. Words so polished, they nearly meant nothing at all. Clara leaned back in her chair at the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office. Aegis lay beneath her desk, breathing slow and steady. The hum of the neon lights flickered across her screen as she reread Lana Marin's file. Field. Transfer destination, Kinvale Institute, upon personal request. Why would a woman recovering from psychological trauma choose a treatment center with no oversight, no verifiable structure? That question gnawed at Clara, and she was never one to let a question go unanswered. She turned on the secure recorder, then opened a hidden channel, an encrypted line to a contact she hadn't spoken to since her federal task force days. Codename: Moss. A former mental health insider turned whistleblower, known for exposing fraudulent recovery programs masked as therapy. "I need to know," Clara said as soon as the signal stabilized, "about Kinvale. There's a boy, sedated, a woman who believes her dead son's soul entered him, and every trail leads back to that place." There was a pause. Then the reply came, low, gravelly, but clear. "You've stepped into a gray zone. Not fully illegal, but not medicine anymore either. Explain. I worked with some of Kinvale's original staff. Back when they still collaborated with state-funded care, they had credentials. But once the new director took over, Dr. Elias Rourke, everything changed. Changed how? They shifted, dropped clinical psychology, started promoting something called soul reconnection therapy. Clara frowned. Sounds like a cult. Not exactly. That's what makes it dangerous. It doesn't require faith, just grief. They don't force belief. They seduce it. Using deep suggestion, they lead grieving parents to imagine their lost child's soul is still present, then hint that it might be inhabiting another child. Just enough to plant the seed. Clara clenched her jaw. And the sedatives? Who authorized drugs for a child? You don't get it, Moss said wearily. The child isn't part of the treatment. They're just the mirror. Patients like Lana are guided toward kids who vaguely match a profile. Then the staff nudges their delusion. Kinvale calls it genetic emotional reflection. Clara leaned back. Every word landed like a stone. How many people have been led this way? I don't know. At least 3 cases were intercepted before abduction. Others may never have been reported. Families think it's just a breakdown, until it isn't. Is there any proof? Nothing digital, but if you can find Kendra Vale, a nurse who worked at Kinvale, she might talk. She left 6 months ago, disappeared after what I heard was an incident. A patient episode during a session turned violent. Kinvale sealed the records. Clara grabbed a pen. Where was she last seen? Rumor says she moved to a temporary rental in Livingston, about 40 miles from Marlow, but I don't have a precise address. I'll find her. Clara, Moss said quietly. Be careful. Kinvale plays within legal lines. They have influence in the healthcare system. If you want to break them, you'll need more than suspicion. You'll need evidence that can't be buried. The line went dead. Clara looked down. Aegis had risen. He stared at her, or rather at what she was holding, a scribbled line in her notebook. Kendra Vale, the silent witness. No command was needed. Aegis stood tall, his tail swept once, slow and sure, not urgent, not anxious, just enough for Clara to understand. It was time to leave the glow of fluorescent lights and step into the dark. When Clara returned to the precinct the next morning, the sky over Marlow Ridge wore a heavy shade of ash gray. The snowstorm had passed, but a thin film of frost still clung to the window panes, like wounds that hadn't fully closed. Aegis followed her into the records room. His steps were light, but never uncertain. Clara knew that gait. It meant something had stirred in him, something deeper than sound or scent. As if a memory was rising from the muck, uninvited but insistent. On the screen in front of her, the name Lana Marin appeared again. She'd requested the tech team to work with child welfare services to extract archived psychological records, despite most being redacted for privacy under protection laws. But a few stray notes had remained in the hospital's 2020 file. And there, Clara found the first name. Charlie Merrick. Born 2018, died June 2020. Cause of death, drowning in a bathtub while the mother was asleep under the influence of sedatives. Mother, Lana Marin. Clara stared at the entry for several long minutes, no sentence longer than 10 words. But within those few lines lived a tragedy no language could carry. A 2-year-old child, dead in his own home, while his mother believed she was closing her eyes for just 5 minutes. She typed in another keyword, Micah Nolan, date of birth. The result hit instantly, and when the date appeared, Clara felt her spine stiffen with cold. Micah was born June 18, 2020. Charlie died June 18, 2020. Same day, same moment, as if one soul had fallen and another had risen through the crack in time, a hairline fracture between loss and arrival, where even the sanest minds could split wide open. Clara buried her head in her hands. No tears. Her profession had taught her to save those for others, but her throat tightened, dry with the ache of too much knowing. A memory surfaced of her own sister years ago, losing her infant son to sudden seizures. Clara remembered the silence, the helplessness, the way grief doesn't knock, it simply takes. And because she understood that pain, she burned with fury. In the medical file, one final note stood out, handwritten, scanned into a PDF. The penmanship was clean, measured, detached, like a physician trying to stay uninvolved in someone else's collapse. Patient demonstrates signs of defensive hallucination around son's death. In 2 most recent therapy sessions, she described feeling that Charlie hasn't truly passed, but is waiting in another form. Reaction triggered during guided imagery therapy. Recommendation: reduce sedative dosage, increase exposure to infant imagery resembling Charlie's facial features. Signed, E.R. Elias Rourke. Clara recoiled from the chair like she'd touched live wire. She printed the entire file. Each page that landed in the tray wasn't just a document, it was evidence, not just of procedural failure, but of something deeper, the exploitation of a mother's most sacred wound. Aegis stood up, stretching, then let out a low growl, not at a hallway noise, but at Clara's trembling hand, something he only responded to when her steadiness cracked. Clara stroked his head, nodding. "I'm okay. We're close." The hospital where Charlie died had since been repurposed as a physical therapy clinic, but its old archives still remained in storage out back. Clara drove there, a warrant from the D.A.'s office in her hand. The records clerk was an elderly man with silver hair and few words. When Clara said the name Charlie Marin, he paused. "Are you police?" he asked. "I'm someone trying to stop a coincidence that never should have happened." The file on Charlie was light, but it felt like it weighed 100 pounds. The final line in the coroner's summary chilled her. Cause of death: accidental drowning. No external trauma. However, mother reported hearing cries after death, a symptom consistent with post-traumatic grief psychosis. Beneath that line was a referral. To Kinvale Institute, signed by Dr. Elias Rourke. The circle closed. Charlie had died the day Micah was born. One life ended, one began, and then a man named Rourke tied them together. One child lost, one child never given a choice. That evening, Clara sat in her office, a desk lamp casting Aegis's shadow long across the wall. She opened her recorder and spoke into the mic. Day 8, I found the pattern. Lana lost her son Charlie, the same day Micah was born. Elias Rourke, director of Kinvale, used guided imagery and suggestive therapy to embed Charlie's memory into an unrelated child. This wasn't an accident, it's a system, and I believe Micah isn't the only one. She looked up. The streetlights outside flickered, early signs of winter turning. Aegis stood, no bark, no growl, just posture, firm, steady, facing the door, eyes locked on the dark. Clara stood, meeting his gaze. "It's time," she whispered. "We need to find Kendra." By midday, cold rain had begun to fall. Each drop struck Clara Jensen's office window like the pounding of a heart caught in warning. Aegis lay by the glass, ears flicking with every distant rumble of thunder. In Clara's hands was a thick, compiled file, weighty like a verdict waiting to be spoken. 4 children, 4 mothers, all patients of Kinvale. She moved her cursor to a recently decrypted data folder, cleared for access only through a rare senior officer override and under an expanding investigation. The screen filled with rows of clinical reports, cold, procedural, emotionless. But Clara saw the pattern. The thread no one else had stitched together. Case 1. Mother, Celia Hargrove. Victim, 3-year-old girl. Real name, Hannah Wu. Incident. Celia approached a bus terminal in Helena, seized the child, and cried out, "My daughter has returned." She was restrained while screaming the name Nellie, her deceased daughter who died of leukemia 5 years prior. Treatment history: Kinvale Institute, noted for image reaction therapy. Current status: declared mentally unfit to stand trial, housed in a secure psychiatric facility. Case 2. Mother, Justine Solares. Victim, 2-year-old boy, Jacob T. Incident. Justine slipped into a community center nursery in Livingston and carried Jacob from his crib during staff break. Surveillance captured her sobbing and whispering, "This time, I won't let you die." Treatment: Kinvale Institute, 12-week program, no official medical notes, only a handwritten remark, transference phase complete. Status: pending charges, uncooperative, frequently references a guiding voice. Case 3. Mother, Miranda Lowell. Victim, no abduction. Incident: caught surveilling a family with a daughter matching her deceased child's appearance, arrested with a necklace engraved with the child's name, despite never having met the girl. Treatment: Kinvale. Therapist. Note: regression incomplete. Recommend therapeutic cycle restart. Status: under long-term psychological observation. Case 4. Mother, Lana Marin. Victim, Micah Nolan. Incident: detained at Marlow Ridge Airport. Child had been administered mild sedatives. Stated belief: Micah is the reincarnation of her late son, Charlie. Program: 14 weeks at Kinvale, overseen by Dr. Elias Rourke. Note: high emotional receptivity, exceptional image assimilation, transference phase near completion. Status: held pending psychological evaluation. Clara leaned back. Aegis lifted his head, eyes on her, not searching for answers, just sensing the weight she was carrying. Kinvale wasn't a place where things had gone wrong. It was a place built to go wrong. A therapy center that had turned grief into architecture, not to heal, but to twist reality into palatable illusions. She stood, reached for her coat. "We're going," she told Aegis. The dog stood at once, ready. No command needed. The car pulled into a small roadside cafe just outside Livingston. Clara had arranged to meet an old contact, Jonah Mathers, a former liaison officer who specialized in missing child support cases. Broad shoulders, graying beard, and a furrow in his brow that deepened every time the word children came up. "You're asking me about Kinvale?" Jonah muttered, flipping through the file Clara laid on the table. "I used to think they were legit, but now—" "They've been patterning emotional links," Clara said softly, "imprinting grieving parents with suggestive cues until any child with a similarity becomes a target." Jonah exhaled slowly, nodding. "What kills me," he said, "is those mothers. They really believe they're saving the child. To them, it's not abduction, it's retrieval." Clara stared through the window. The sky was still gray, but her mind had gone sharper. "Jonah," she asked, "if the person running Kinvale understands the psychological consequences and continues anyway, what does that make him?" Jonah didn't hesitate. "Reality fabrication, exploitation of belief, constructed facilitation of criminal behavior. The mothers aren't the root of this. The guilt belongs to the one who guided them off the ledge." Clara nodded slowly. "Elias Rourke," she whispered. "We need a live witness," Jonah said, tapping the file. "Someone from the inside. Someone who saw it happen." Clara looked at Aegis, then back at Jonah. "Not yet," she said, "but I have a lead, and I believe she wants to be found." Fine rain fell like threads of silver, draping the narrow back streets of Old Belridge in a quiet curtain of mist. Streetlights faded into the fog, making the rundown motel at the end of the road appear as though it had been swallowed by the dark. Clara Jensen parked quietly. Aegis walked beside her, his frame taut, his eyes scanning every corner of the alleyway, each step drawn like the string of a bow. Room 6B, the last door down the corridor. That's where the name Rain Velas showed up in the files. A new name, a new life. A woman who had disappeared from society 3 months after leaving Kinvale. Before that, she had been known as Kendra Vale. The door creaked open on Clara's second knock. A pale face emerged. Young, disheveled hair, deep shadows beneath hollow eyes. Her hands trembled slightly, tucked behind the doorframe. "I didn't do anything wrong. I was just a nurse." Clara raised her badge, but kept her tone soft. "I'm not here to accuse you. I'm here because I believe you might be the only one left who can stop this from happening to another child." Silence. Aegis took a step forward. He didn't bark, didn't growl. He simply lowered his head and sat by the door, an unspoken promise. "We will not harm you." Something strange happened. Rain looked directly into Aegis's eyes, and after a pause that seemed to stretch beyond time, she opened the door wide. The room was small, walls stained with mildew, but meticulously organized. Everything placed with deliberate care, like someone trying to control the storm inside by keeping the outside in order. "You don't know how hard I've tried to forget," Rain said, gripping her hands tightly as she sat down. Clara turned on the recorder. Her voice remained gentle. "Start from the beginning. Anything you remember." Rain exhaled and spoke. "I joined Kinvale thinking I was helping grieving mothers. They needed healing. At first, it felt compassionate. But then I was assigned to the private program. Dr. Rourke didn't want many people involved, only staff he trusted. I needed the work. I needed the money. I started distributing medication. No labels, just small vials. Light pink fluid. He called it guided sedation therapy. After each dose, the mothers, they'd start to believe their children had never died." Rain shivered. One woman woke up crying, said her son had just called her. Another pointed to a random photo and whispered, "That's my Max. I know those eyes." Clara clenched her jaw. Everything she'd suspected was real. Then came the first case. One mother just vanished from the center. 3 weeks later, I read the headline. She'd been caught trying to sneak into a family's home, saying she had to bring her child back. I asked Rourke. He said, "Memory is rarely perfect, but emotion is true, and we must trust emotion to heal." Aegis let out a deep, low growl. Clara placed a firm hand on his head, steadying both him and herself. "Then there was Lana Marin," Rain murmured, voice cracking. "I remember her so clearly. She didn't scream, didn't panic. She just sat, every day, staring at an old photo, a little boy, with dimples. I once told her, 'Your son is beautiful.' She didn't speak. She just smiled and whispered, 'He's coming back. The doctor said he's finding his way home.'" Rain began to cry. Clara didn't interrupt. She let the girl collapse inward, because some doors only open when no one forces them. When the tears quieted, Clara finally spoke. "Rain, do you understand what you've just said? It's evidence, but it only matters if you're willing to testify." "They'll find me," Rain whispered. "Rourke, he's not just a doctor. He's got backing, funding from institutes. I was just a nurse." Clara's voice firmed. "You're not just anything. You're the first person who didn't look away." Aegis stood. He approached slowly, silently, and rested his head gently on Rain's knee. A gesture so simple, and yet it broke something open inside her. "I'll testify," she said, voice shaking. On the drive back, Clara uploaded the entire recording and Rain's full statement to the Federal Investigative Task Force. Aegis sat in the back seat, eyes wide open, watching the passing blur of street lamps. "We have the first piece," Clara murmured, "and you made her believe, just by being there, doing nothing, just being." Aegis let out a soft whine, not from pain, from understanding. That night, as Clara sat down to log her notes, she recorded, "Some witnesses don't need to speak. They only need someone to believe them. And some guardians don't need orders. They just know. What's right? Rain Vale was the first. But I know. She won't be the last." Room 214 at Marlow Ridge Children's Center was bathed in a soft amber glow of early morning. Outside the window, Winter's garden lay quiet beneath a thin veil of mist. The last remnants of the storm still clung to empty benches, like snow left behind by memory. Inside, the stillness was so complete that even the soft beeping of the heart monitor felt like a whisper. Micah lay in the hospital bed, a thin blanket pulled across his chest. His small hands, still and pale for nearly 3 days, moved for the first time. His eyelids remained half shut, but his chest had begun to rise and fall gently. Clara stood just outside the observation glass, arms folded, eyes locked on the child, as if looking alone could hold her heart together. Florence sat by the bedside, clutching a worn, one-eared teddy bear, an old toy passed down through 2 generations. Her eyes were red, but no longer frantic, just waiting. A waiting that said more than panic ever could. Aegis lay a short distance from the bed. He didn't move, his body poised like a living statue, head bowed slightly, ears tilted forward, eyes wide and unblinking. A sentinel, awake and watching. Then, from the bed, a faint sound broke the silence. "Woof!" Florence rose sharply. Clara stepped into the room. "Micah?" Florence whispered, afraid any louder sound might shatter the moment. The boy's eyes fluttered open, hazy at first, searching. Then they settled on Aegis. "Woof woof!" This time, clearly. So clear that Aegis let out a soft whimper in response, then rose slowly and walked to the side of the bed, close enough to be seen, but not to overwhelm. Micah reached out. His hand moved slowly, deliberately, like a gesture drawn not from thought, but from something deeper. His fingers touched the fur on Aegis's neck, and he smiled. His first smile since the day he was found at the airport. Florence broke down. She dropped to her knees beside the bed, pressing her cheek against her grandson's hand. "You remember him, don't you? It's Aegis, the dog you met once. Remember?" Clara froze for a moment. A line from an old welfare report resurfaced in her mind. Micah attended the Family and K9 Connection Day at Belridge Community Hospital. A therapy dog group was present, including one named Aegis. She pulled out her phone, searched the archives. A photo appeared, dated exactly on Micah's 2nd birthday. A boy in a red wool sweater hugging the neck of a deep-coated dog with a K9 behavioral harness. Clear eyes, wind-blushed cheeks, a laugh frozen in time. Clara looked at Aegis. "You've met him before." Aegis didn't react. He just sat, motionless, watching Micah. Not like a trained responder, but like something older, more enduring. That afternoon, Florence shared more. Her voice was raspy but steady. After that day, Micah stopped being afraid of sleep. He used to have night terrors, would sleepwalk, scream, but after meeting Aegis, he held his teddy bear and told me, "I have a friend now." Clara nodded slowly. There are connections buried in childhood memory that no adult fully understands. A single meeting, a soft paw, one gentle gaze. Sometimes that's all it takes to anchor safety into a fragile heart. Aegis had once been that shelter. That evening, as Florence and Micah finally drifted to sleep, Clara stepped into the hallway and dialed Jonah. Aegis met Micah before. There's a photo. There's a recorded event. I think it wasn't just instinct. He remembered the face. On the other end, Jonah exhaled. That makes him more than a working dog, Clara. That makes him a survivor, with memory. And that boy, he's coming back to us because of it. Clara glanced over her shoulder. Aegis lay just outside the hospital room door. He didn't sleep. He simply listened, ears twitching at every footstep down the corridor. And I think, Clara said quietly, that memory isn't done guiding him yet. Not just to the past, but to others still waiting. The Belridge City Library sat atop a quiet hill, tucked between rows of towering pines and moss-covered stone steps. It was the kind of place people visited to escape the chaos of life, not to chase the ghost of a man who'd vanished from every medical record in the National Registry. But for Clara Jensen, every lead mattered. Especially now, when Dr. Elias Rourke, director of Kinvale Institute, had disappeared without a trace. No bank activity, no forwarding address, no resignation letter, no acknowledgement from the Department of Health. It was as if Rourke had never existed, at least not on paper. Clara stepped into the library's main hall at 9 a.m., armed with documents Rain had provided from the Guided Regressive Memory Therapy Program. One page, near the bottom corner, had a tiny handwritten note. Ref. Kinvale LBR Archive 1987. Excuse me, Clara asked a middle-aged librarian restocking books. I'm looking for records from the precursor to Kinvale, an old project from the 1980s. The librarian stared at her as if she had mentioned a ghost. He nodded slowly, then led her down into the basement archives, where no Wi-Fi reached, no air conditioning hummed, and only the scent of time-worn paper and dust remained. In the aisle labeled History of Applied Psychology, Montana, Clara found a box marked with a red seal. LBR Behavioral Study Unit, 1983-1990. Inside were yellowed photocopies, faded ink, and redacted lines struck out by heavy black markers. But one name repeated again and again: E. Rourke, Ph.D., Dr. Elias Rourke. Report number 28. Proposal to convert the LBR Behavioral Center into a Civil Psychological Recovery Institute. Suggested name: Kinvale Institute. Report number 34. Trial on artificial memory reflexes in grieving parents. Documented cases of misidentification of minors. Clara's grip on the file tightened. He's been doing this for over 30 years. She carefully scanned each document, backed it up to internal systems, then drove straight to the first known address where Rourke once worked: Helena University Medical Center. There, in the retired records room, an elderly clerk named Lottie vaguely remembered him. Rourke? Yes, I remember. He always dressed so proper, but there was something in his eyes, not like a doctor, more like an observer, always studying you. How did he leave the facility? Clara asked. He just left. There was an incident. A mother confused someone else's child for her own, caused chaos in the therapy ward. Soon after, Rourke vanished. The department was restructured, and a few years later, Kinvale was born. On her way back to Marlow Ridge, Clara called Jonah, who was digging through federal medical records. Is there any psychiatric license under the name Elias Rourke? No, Jonah answered. But something stranger came up. He holds a Ph.D. in applied behavioral science from a now-defunct private lab, Pacific Cognitive Lab, shut down due to ethical violations in human trials. Clara pulled over. Her heart pounded. What kind of trials? Emotional manipulation using stimulus agents. They focused on individuals coping with loss, especially parents grieving children. There are notes documenting emotional displacement, replacing grief with false connection. Clara closed her eyes. The final puzzle piece clicked into place. Rourke wasn't just a doctor. He was the architect of a method he called soul rebinding, a twisted theory of memory misalignment disguised as healing. Scientific heresy more dangerous than superstition. That night, back at her office, Clara spread out a map of Montana and marked every known location tied to Rourke. Helena, Bell Ridge, Kinvale, an old training camp, a cabin in the northern woods. Aegis lay quietly under the desk. But when Clara pinned an old photo to the map, one showing Rourke beside a woman holding a child in a red sweater, Aegis suddenly raised his head. He let out a low, deep growl. Clara leaned in. "You recognize the woman?" Aegis whimpered, then turned towards the window. Clara stood up abruptly. "We're going. The northern cabin." There was no time to wait, not when children were still being led away, by mothers who truly believed they were just bringing their babies home. Morning fog blanketed the forest surrounding Kinvale Center, weaving a veil of white silk so delicate it felt like the silence of a lie left untouched for too long. Under the sweep of headlights through towering trees, Aegis moved ahead of the raid team like a loyal shadow. Silent, unwavering. Clara stood beside the Rapid Response Unit leader, Police Chief Jonah, and 3 federal agents. She wore lightweight armor, a sidearm holstered, and held a freshly authorized state-level warrant for a full facility search, approved less than 2 hours ago. Kinvale had opened its doors earlier than usual that morning. "We're here for a court-mandated inspection," Clara said, presenting the papers. The front desk attendant, an older man with graying hair, wearing a cardigan and a name tag that read Carlis Counselor, glanced at the warrant, his expression unreadable. "I need to call management," he said. "No need," Jonah interjected firmly. "Your facility is under federal investigation. From now on, everything proceeds under judicial order." Carlis stepped back. Hesitation flickered across his face, but not enough to raise an alarm. Aegis entered the main hall, scanning each corridor with eyes that seemed to track things beyond scent or sound. Remnants of memories forcibly planted, invisible to most but suffocating to those who had survived them. Kinvale's ground floor bore every sign of a therapeutic haven. Art therapy room, emotional restoration space, mother-child connection center. Clean, orderly, draped in soft colors and ambient lullabies drifting faintly in the air. A meticulous facade. But Aegis didn't pause for any of it. He led the team toward a stairwell at the end of the corridor, stopping before a narrow metal door secured with a keypad. "Clara," Jonah called. "This level's not on the floor plans. No basement registered." Clara nodded. A tech stepped forward and disabled the lock. A soft click sounded. The door swung open. Below was a spiral staircase of cold iron, descending into a space bathed in an amber glow, like time had come to a halt and belonged to no known era. With every step downward, the air thickened. The sound bounced strangely off soundproofed walls, as if they were entering the inner chambers of a programmed mind. Aegis suddenly halted at the final step. He lowered his body, let out a low growl, and slowly advanced into the room beyond. Clara followed first, and froze. It was a large, windowless room. No clocks, no natural light, just a row of cribs, each arranged with eerie precision. Inside each one lay a doll dressed like a real infant, swaddled in cloth, one-piece sleepers, even painted on birthmarks behind the ear, an exact match to the descriptions of the missing children Clara had read. From the ceiling, hidden speakers played a looped lullaby in a soft, female voice. "Charlie, Mama's coming now. Sweet Charlie, I'll never leave again. Clara turned to Jonah. His eyes were bloodshot. This isn't therapy, he whispered. This is cognitive reprogramming. A large placard hung above the room. Special Maternal Recovery Unit, Zone A. In one corner, security cameras mounted above each crib captured footage 24/7. A technician immediately began extracting the data drives. There's another room, a federal agent called out. They entered a small chamber, a personalized counseling room, fitted with a one-way mirror, soft chairs, warm lights, shelves of children's toys and photographs. On the desk lay a patient journal, handwritten in soft curves. Micah smiled when I played Charlie's voice. I know his soul is still here. I just need more time. It's Lana's handwriting, Clara whispered. Her hand shook as she turned to the final entry, the ink more jagged, letters warped with pressure. Elias says I'll be granted permanent custody if I can identify the soul without fail. Just one, just Charlie, back to me. Clara closed the journal. Aegis stepped toward the nearest crib and sniffed the doll. This time his growl wasn't cautious. It was fury. As the raid team prepared to seal off the sublevel, Clara returned to the stairwell entrance, where a motion-activated light flickered faintly with each step taken. She spoke softly. We've just opened the door to the deepest fracture in human trust. This was never a place of healing. It was where grief was taught to trade truth for illusion. Aegis stood beside her, eyes fixed straight ahead. In the absolute stillness of that windowless room, a system that blurred the line between memory and manipulation had finally been exposed. And from this moment forward, it was no longer just an investigation. It was a fight to bring people back, from the dream they were led to believe was real. Clara had never seen Aegis lose composure, but when the third USB drive was unlocked and the first image flickered onto the screen, an old Polaroid of a newborn lying in a crib bathed in warm amber light, Aegis let out a low growl. Not loud, but long, as if something buried deep inside him had been awakened. The digital forensics room at the Marlow Ridge Police Department glowed with the light of multiple surveillance monitors. On the wall, frame after frame appeared, a child cradled in a woman's arms, a windowless room, plastic cribs, synthetic light, a whiteboard with scribbled notes, soul profile number 12, real name, Mason biological mother, Alyssa Graves replacement child, Caleb S., 14 months memory compatibility score, 87%. Jonah stared, unblinking. He built a soul-matching system? Clara nodded, her fingers scrolling through the directory. Folder 01, Replacement Project Folder 02, Therapy Journals Folder 03, Soul Profiles. They opened the third folder, and it was like flipping through a warped gospel written by a fanatic, one where every child was redefined as a vessel for a displaced soul. Soul Profile, number 04. Original name, Ivy Tolland, age at death, 3 years, attachment markers, gray eyes, slight left-hand curve, matched soul, Grace L., 3 years, 2 months, status, emotional transference completed. Clara's skin crawled. He actually believed in this. Jonah exhaled sharply. Not belief, systemization. Every grief was decoded, then plugged into another mold. Aegis remained still beneath the desk, eyes fixed on the screen. Inside a subfolder titled Classification, they found charts, eye color grids, bone structure diagrams, cry spectrums, archived DNA samples. But what stopped Clara cold were the pencil sketches. A thick stack, drawn by hand, labeled meticulously, Soul number 7, facial expression when dreaming of lost mother. Soul number 15, hand cling reflex when old name is called. Soul number 23, non-reaction to unfamiliar toys. Each sketch felt like casting notes for a ghost, a vessel Rourke believed he could engineer to fit the hollow in a grieving mother's chest. Clara whispered, "This isn't therapy. This is memory direction." One extracted video showed Elias Rourke himself, thin, silver-haired, eyes not manic but disturbingly rational. He spoke directly to the camera. "When someone loses a child, the pain is not in the absence. It's in the mind having nowhere to store memory. I don't replace what's lost. I simply embed it into a vacant shell. We do not resurrect. We overwrite." Clara's fists clenched. Aegis rose, growling low. In the corner, Rain trembled. "This I never saw. They hid it from us. Only senior staff knew about the replacement project. They told me it was just a psychological redirection model, nothing about soul implantation." Clara stepped over to her, voice soft. "You were the one who stopped more injections. Aegis could feel that." Rain fell silent, eyes glistening. "I still hear it. A child answering to a name that wasn't theirs, and mothers smiling, not at their child, but at a name they once knew. They believed. That's what terrified me most." By day's end, Clara and Jonah submitted an emergency proposal for a statewide investigation. Kinvale wasn't a standalone facility. It was a replicable ideology, a doctrine dressed as healing. In her preliminary report, Clara wrote by hand, "This is not therapy. This is a memory matrix where children become physical canvases for souls they never carried." That evening, Clara stepped out into the empty hallway of the precinct. The corridors were quiet. Aegis walked beside her, silent. She paused near a glass panel reflecting light from the incident room, where images of still unidentified children rotated slowly on screen. "You saw all of it, didn't you?" she asked softly. Aegis didn't respond. But when a faint laugh echoed from a video still playing down the hall, a child's voice, barely audible, the dog stopped, ears twitching, head raised, as if guarding a spirit that no longer belonged to that room. Clara rested a hand on her waist. Steady. "Tomorrow," she said, "we're going back to Kinvale. And this time, we're bringing the real memories home." The file was stamped in red, its ink faded with time. In the top left corner, bold type read, "Melanie Kane. Involuntary psychiatric case. Emergency classification." Clara sat silently in the patrol car, parked outside the Hopefield Institute for Mental Care, just south of the town of Loris Creek. Beside her, Aegis sat still, head slightly tilted, as if he had sensed the shift in air long before the engine stopped. The incident detailed in the file was simple, yet deeply unsettling. 3 years ago, Melanie Kane, a former elementary school teacher, had attempted to lift a 5-year-old girl into her arms at the Sweet Mart grocery store, repeating over and over, "She's mine. I birthed her again. I have the right." The girl had screamed until her voice cracked. Staff and security intervened in time. No injuries. But the case was filed as a psychotic break with reality following the death of her first daughter. Melanie was admitted to Hopefield. But in Clara's expanded investigation, Melanie's name surfaced in a recovered Kinvale hard drive. Candidate for Phase 3 treatment, Memory Substitution Protocol Number 7. The Hopefield Institute sat on a quiet plot surrounded by pines, white fences, and weathered shingles. The morning breeze was crisp around Clara's every step as she led Aegis through the security gate. An orderly escorted them to a group therapy room. Melanie sat alone in the back, wrapped in a pale beige cardigan, her hair prematurely silver, her gaze distant, not deranged, just suspended between two realities. Clara sat gently across from her. Aegis rested by her side, his eyes locked on Melanie. "I'm Officer Clara Jensen," she said softly. "I'm not here to investigate you. I'm here to listen. If you're ready." Melanie looked at Aegis first. Not surprised, not frightened. She whispered, I know that dog. Clara reached into her bag and pulled out a photo recovered from Kinvale. The hallway wall with Aegis's image beneath the words, Visual Memory Trigger, symbol number 3. Melanie leaned forward, fingertips grazing the corner of the photograph, trembling. They hung that in the symbolic recovery corridor. I walked past it 3 times a day. And each time, my chest ached. I didn't know why back then, only that I'd seen him before. Then they told me. Her voice cracked. Told you what? Clara asked gently. They said he was the guardian of memory, that seeing him meant I was close to my daughter, Liana. Aegis let out a quiet whine, not of distress, but of sensing a wound reopened. Melanie spoke haltingly, fragmented. When she first arrived at Kinvale, the grief was so raw she couldn't even say her daughter's name. All she remembered was a purple bow in her braided hair and a laugh like silver bells. Rourke told her to write down everything she could recall, and every day they walked her past curated images, toys, soft lighting, classical music. I thought I was healing, she choked, but they were crafting a new version of her, a different Liana. They said, if I believed strongly enough, I'd recognize her in the real world. And I believed them. She turned away. When I saw the girl at the supermarket, she was holding the exact same doll from Kinvale. I thought Liana had come back. Clara didn't interrupt. No one had the right to judge a mother among the wreckage of memory. Melanie inhaled deeply. And this dog... She looked at Aegis. He was the tether. Every time I saw his eyes, I believed I hadn't lost my way, that there was still a road back. Now I see. They exploited that feeling. Clara bowed her head. She pulled out a small card and placed it gently on the table. We're expanding the investigation into Kinvale. If you're willing, I'd like you to testify. Melanie stared at the card, then back at Aegis. What did they call him? She asked. Aegis, Clara replied. In ancient Greek, it means shield. Melanie smiled, the first time in the entire conversation. That's right. They called him the memory shield. But maybe now, he's finally returned to his true role, the one who unravels the lie. On the way back, Clara pulled over by the hillside. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windshield, painting golden streaks across the trembling pines. She looked at Aegis, lying down, but fully alert. They turned you into a tool, a symbol, but now that same symbol is saving souls. Aegis didn't bark. He only leaned over to gently lick her hand. Clara whispered, We still have more to save, don't we? A gust of wind rushed through the ravine, as if something, or someone, answered from the depths of memory. I miss my child. But I don't need a replacement. I need permission to remember. Clara stood motionless before the cold stone wall inside Kinvale's auxiliary archive room, where she and Rain Valus had just cracked open the lock on a steel cabinet marked Special Documentation. On the table lay a stack of laminated files, each sheet detailing a section of Kinvale's visual memory reconstruction protocol. But what took the air from Clara's lungs weren't the clinical terms. It was the photographs. One of them, unmistakably, was Aegis. The same posture, the same gaze, the same dark sable coat. Except beneath the image, bold letters declared, Memory Q symbol, Trial 4, B, Aegis, K9, ID 118-R. Activation response rate, 72%. Beside it, a handwritten note by Elias Rourke. If the subject reports an emotional connection to Aegis, despite no prior contact, we can confirm belief formation. From here, artificial memory can be initiated. Aegis is the first anchor. Clara's hands curled into fists. She looked down at Aegis, lying calmly beneath the table. He returned her gaze, clear, still, unwavering, Her voice was hoarse. "They turned you into a prophecy, a doorway for grieving parents to believe their child's soul had returned." The next file bore the name Catherine Winslow. Her extracted testimonial read, "When I saw that dog, no one had to tell me anything. I knew. That was the sign. Charlie had come back in another child's body. Only Charlie ever loved dogs like that. Only Charlie dreamt of riding a big dog across a field." Taped to the margin was a newspaper clipping. Aegis standing beside a group of children at the ribbon cutting of a new K-9 center the previous year. And then Clara remembered. Micah had attended that very ceremony, with his grandmother. That evening, at Florence Nolan's home, Clara sat beneath the soft glow of a yellow lamp. Florence placed an old sketchbook in front of her, drawings Micah made when he was just 2 years old. "He rarely drew," Florence said, "but this one chilled me the first time I saw it." Clara flipped open the book. One page was crinkled, a childish pencil drawing of a large dog standing beside a little boy holding a ball. Next to them was a faded outline, a woman with long hair, unlike Florence. In the corner, clumsy scribbles read, "Me with doggy and new mom." Florence exhaled. "I thought it was just imagination, but now, I fear, that photo of Aegis was the first seed." Clara sat in silence. The fragments were beginning to align. Elias Rourke hadn't just manipulated mothers. He targeted the children, too. Planting seeds of emotional familiarity through harmless encounters, community fairs, newspaper photos, posters on clinic walls, and Aegis, with his noble stance, soulful eyes, and stoic presence, became the perfect symbol to anchor something that had never truly existed. Back at the regional precinct, Clara pinned the photos to the primary case board. Aegis at the parade, Aegis in Kinvale, the sketchbook, patient journals. She drew red string between the points. At the center, Aegis. Rain stood beside her, hands trembling. So they used him as a test. If a child recognized the dog, it meant the match was right. Such a simple trial, but enough to make a mother believe. Clara nodded, eyes heavy. "I used to think Aegis singled out Lana because she was dangerous, but now, maybe he was reacting to Micah, to the connection they'd once had. And that reaction, it was weaponized to reinforce a lie." She knelt beside Aegis and stroked his fur gently. "You weren't wrong. You were just a living witness. And because of that, you became undeniable evidence." That night, alone in the precinct dorm, Clara reopened the drawing. Micah, Aegis, and the new mom. She wrote in her investigation journal, "In all of Kinvale's protocols, the image of Aegis is the perfect emotional bait. No words, no coercion, no hypnosis. Just one long enough glance. And from there, a child believes they're remembering something that never was. Aegis is not just a detector of danger. He's a mirror, reflecting false memory back to itself." She stopped writing, looked over at Aegis, now dozing in the corner. "But this time, your eyes will help them remember the truth." Outside the window, snow began to fall again, soft, steady, like memory itself, slowly shedding its false layers until only the naked path remains. The pediatric wing of St. Alora's Hospital wasn't as crowded as most. The hallway glowed softly under warm, golden lights, the usual scent of disinfectant replaced by a trace of lavender oil in the air. But in room 204, where Micah Nolan lay, everything was quieter still. Clara sat outside the room. Her police uniform still bore dust from the Kinvale raid, but her eyes now held no trace of suspicion, only a quiet kind of waiting. Behind the closed door, Aegis was inside. For the first time, Aegis wasn't a guard dog. He wasn't living evidence. He had been allowed in, an exception granted by the hospital's child psychologist, as a therapy dog, a silent companion. Micah had been fully detoxed, but for the past 48 hours he hadn't spoken, hadn't cried, hadn't smiled. His eyes were open but distant, as if behind a thin veil, seeing but not seeing. Inside the room, Aegis lay quietly beside the small white hospital bed. Micah sat on the edge, tiny legs dangling. He wasn't afraid, but there was no joy either, only emptiness. Aegis didn't bark, didn't whine. He just breathed, slow, steady, kept the right distance, no intrusion, no demand. Then, Micah's gaze met his. At first it was just a glance. Then the boy sat up a little straighter, tilted his head, and then the silence broke. A sound no louder than a whisper, but in that hospital room it rang like a bell. Woof, woof. Aegis didn't react with excitement. He simply wagged his tail, once, then again. Micah smiled. Not long, not bright. But it was a smile, the first one since everything. Outside, Florence gripped the doorframe. When she heard that tiny woof, her tears came before she could stop them. The door opened just a sliver, enough for her to step in. In her hands was an old toy, a worn brown teddy bear, one ear torn, stitched back with white thread. "Micah," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "do you remember this friend?" The boy looked at the bear, silent for a few seconds. His eyes widened just a little. Then slowly, so slowly, he reached out. When his fingers touched the bear, he didn't hug it right away. He looked at Aegis, then at Florence, and finally, he pulled the bear close to his chest and whispered, "My friend." Florence sank to her knees beside the bed. The tears came freely now. Aegis moved closer, still low to the ground, head bowed slightly. Micah leaned in, stretched out a hand, and gently touched the warm fur along his back, then rested his head there. Woof, woof, came back. Outside the room, the head of pediatric psychology stood with arms folded, observing through the one-way glass. "We can safely say something's been activated," he said quietly. Clara didn't answer. She kept her eyes on Aegis. "Not a planted memory," she murmured. "Not something triggered by therapy. It's a real connection from a long, long time ago." That night, Clara returned to her desk. She opened a new case file on her laptop. Aegis, the wordless guide. She began typing. Not every investigative tool is meant to be wielded. Some presences don't speak, don't prove. They simply appear at the right moment, and at the right moment they stay silent. Aegis didn't lead anyone to the truth. He simply stood there until they remembered what they had once forgotten. He didn't save Micah with a bark. He saved him with stillness, the kind that only appears when one's soul has once brushed against another. The next morning, Micah woke up early. He didn't cry for milk. He didn't ask questions. He just looked towards the window, where the curtain had been pulled back, and Aegis lay waiting. "Woof, woof," the boy called. Aegis stood, walked over, and touched his nose to the boy's outstretched hand. Florence stood nearby, holding an old photo album. She opened to a picture from last year's ceremony, Micah holding hands with a female officer, smiling beside a German shepherd. Beneath the photo, in slanted handwriting, "My woof-woof dog." She didn't need to ask anymore. Micah remembered, not through reason, but through feeling. And feelings, real ones, can't be implanted. Later, as Clara walked the hallway, a nurse passed by, smiling. "We don't need any more therapy plans," she said gently. "The boy's already found his companion." Clara glanced into room 204. Aegis curled up beside the hospital bed. Micah hugged his teddy bear, his head resting on Aegis's side. A woman nearby asked softly, "Is he a therapy dog?" Clara shook her head slightly. the guide, in the kind of lostness we call memory. Interrogation Room 3 at the Marlow Ridge Police Department had no two-way mirror, no ceiling camera, no harsh spotlight like in the movies. Everything was designed to look ordinary, quiet enough to trick someone into feeling heard, and sealed just enough to prevent anyone from escaping their own thoughts. Lana Marin sat at the center of it all. No longer the elegant woman in a gray wool coat, silk scarf, and Italian leather boots. Now in a pale blue hospital gown, hair loose, eyes vacant, dark circles beneath them, like someone who hadn't truly slept in weeks. Across from her sat Clara Jensen. No case file, no handcuffs, not even a glass of water to stage an interrogation. Only a single pen, lying horizontally on the cold metal table. The silence stretched past 2 minutes. Clara didn't speak. Lana didn't either. Until Lana broke it, voice hoarse and faint, nearly mistaken for breath. "I didn't want to hurt him." Clara tilted her head slightly, said nothing. "I just wanted Charlie to come back." The words, when they landed, didn't stab. They soaked, like a damp shroud over the room, not aggressive, not tense, but saturated with something rot-like, delusion, rationalized. Clara leaned forward, forearms resting on the table. "You know his real name is Micah, don't you?" Lana didn't answer. Her lips tightened. One hand curled around her elbow, like someone hugging a wound too private to unwrap. "You know he has a grandmother, a teddy bear with one ear torn that he's held since he was born. A photo taken at a children's memorial fair, with Aegis standing next to him. None of that is about Charlie." Lana closed her eyes. "But Charlie had a bear like that, too." Clara paused. "That's the problem, had. You're pulling a living child into a hole that can't be filled." The air turned heavier. Lana opened her eyes, looked directly at Clara, for the first time. Her voice trembled. "You don't understand. Charlie didn't just die. He disappeared. One morning I picked him up from his crib, and he didn't call me Mommy anymore. And then, just days later, the accident. I never got the chance to fix it." Clara inhaled slowly. "I understand, and that's exactly what makes you dangerous." Lana flinched. "Dangerous?" "Yes, because you think your pain is so deep, so real, that it gives you permission to rewrite someone else's, to use their grief as a cure for your own." Lana froze. Clara continued. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was firm, like stone under velvet. "You don't have to be evil to cause harm. Sometimes all it takes is believing you're right. So right, you stop seeing that others are still bleeding." Lana lowered her head. Her shoulders trembled. But she didn't cry. Just someone who had finally dropped a mask, fused too long to the skin. Clara stood. She looked at Lana not with anger, but with a quiet finality, the way you might look at someone who had once been a victim, but could no longer stay one. "I'll send you for one final psychological evaluation. But I want you to understand something. Charlie doesn't need to come back. And Micah, the boy whose life you almost shattered, still has a life to live. And the first part of that life is to not be trapped in someone else's belief." Outside the room, Aegis lay waiting by the door. He lifted his head as Clara stepped out. Didn't bark, didn't whine, just looked at her. Calm, steady, as if he already knew how that conversation had ended. Clara sat beside him, leaning back against the wall, shoulder brushing his. Some people love so hard, they forget what they're meant to hold on to is memory, not possession. Aegis rested his chin on her knee. A wordless embrace. Clara stroked the length of his back. "If it weren't for you, All of this might have disappeared into silence. Down the hall, footsteps echoed. An officer handed Clara a new file. On the front, Melanie Kane, report on object-triggered memory replacement syndrome. Clara opened the first page. A photo of Aegis hanging on a wall inside Kinvale, not a gateway to heaven, but a maze. A maze where people tricked themselves into believing the exit was a way back. And Aegis, without knowing, had become the map. The sky hung leaden over the northern border of Montana as the federal tactical SUV sped across the frost-bitten highway. Snow hadn't yet fallen, but the ground had cracked with cold, as if nature itself were holding its breath, watching the pursuit. Elias Rourke, the man behind Kinvale Institute, wasn't the type to panic. He didn't wield a weapon, didn't flee into the woods, didn't scream nonsense when cornered. Instead, he wore a charcoal overcoat, a knit cap pulled over his ears, and sat calmly aboard a rented civilian shuttle en route to the Canadian border checkpoint. Had it not been for a tip from Agent Clara Jensen and a traffic camera that captured Rourke boarding the bus in the quiet town of Havenbrook that morning, he might have slipped through. But he didn't slip past Aegis. Clara moved quickly past the checkpoint barricades as the tactical team encircled the bus. Aegis walked beside her. No leash, no hesitation, his eyes sharp with that instinctive alertness that couldn't be trained. "It's the right bus," said one FBI agent, voice taut as wire. "Third row from the back. He's unarmed, but—" Clara tightened her gloves. Her eyes sliced through the air like steel. "He doesn't need weapons. His mind's dangerous enough." The shuttle came to a halt. 3 officers approached, one at the rear, 2 flanking the side doors. Clara stepped forward, nodding calmly. "Rourke." The man turned. Silver hair spilled from beneath his cap, his face unreadable, eyes a pale, frozen blue, as emotionless as a glacial lake, but tinged with respect. "Clara Jensen," he greeted, lips barely curved. "Shame. I was hoping you'd be 10 minutes late. And I was hoping you'd understand. The time for illusions is over." Aegis moved forward. No bark, no growl. Just stood, between the bus door and Rourke, like a line of morality that must not be crossed. Rourke let out a faint chuckle. "He's the purest form of all our watchdogs. He doesn't question. He simply feels." Clara nodded. "And you used that feeling to implant illusions." An officer began reading the arrest warrant. Rourke didn't resist, but as the cuffs snapped around his wrists, he pulled a sealed folder from his coat pocket. Before being led away, he handed it to Clara. "A parting gift." She accepted it, her eyes never leaving his. "What's inside?" Rourke smiled, calm, as if handing over a poem to an old classmate. "Profiles, new candidates, women, broken souls, waiting for a door to open. I didn't deceive them. I merely showed them what they desired most." Clara's fingers tightened around the file. Her voice lowered. "And in doing so, took away what little truth they still had." Rourke only shrugged. "If there's such a thing as losing, I think they were reborn." At the Marlow Ridge Federal Investigation Center, Clara opened the file in a secured room. On the desk, 6 folders, 6 women. Each had lost a child. Each had written to Kinvale with the same desperate plea. "Please help me see my child again, even if only in a dream." Inside one was a crude drawing, a black-furred dog standing beside a child holding a doll. Attached to the sketch was a note, handwritten by Dr. Rourke. "If the child recognizes the figure of Aegis, then the inner soul has returned to its rightful place. This marks the beginning of memory activation." Clara stared at the note, then at Aegis, lying quietly beneath the desk. "No," she whispered. "Aegis isn't a symbol of reincarnation. He's the one being in this entire mess, who can't be deceived by human longing. The next morning at the press conference, Clara made only one statement. Elias Rourke didn't just build a treatment institute. He built a gate. But behind that gate was no heaven. It was a hell sewn together with fabricated memories. Rourke was taken into federal custody, but the fractures he left behind, the emotional debris, would remain. Clara knew it. The task force knew it. And Aegis, the only one who needed no words to detect the unnatural, knew it too. The question was no longer, have we stopped the deception? But rather, how many more are quietly waiting for a miracle, only to be ushered into the maze of illusion? It was a late autumn morning when the sun filtered through the red maples, casting flames of soft light across the southern valley of Marlow Ridge. On a gentle hillside, a renovated wooden house, once an old veterinary outpost, now bore a new identity. A handcrafted wooden sign swung quietly by the gate. Aegis Haven, where no one is left behind. From a distance, Clara stood silently, watching the grounds fill with laughter, children's voices and wagging tails blending like wind and memory. Beside her, Aegis sat still, head slightly tilted, as if wondering, will this place be warm enough for wounds that never healed? Florence stepped out from the main lodge, her soft, butter-colored sweater speckled with ink stains from the weathered journal in her hands. She smiled gently at Clara. "He's already on duty," Florence said, nodding towards the open field, where a brown-haired girl was sitting beside a dark German shepherd, learning for the first time how to touch a world she once feared. Aegis observed from a distance. He didn't interfere. He simply watched, a silent sentinel. Aegis Haven was born during a sleepless night, when Florence sat beside Micah, who had curled up with Aegis's old coat as though it were the only thing shielding him from the nightmares. She had written in her journal, "If one dog can keep a child from dreaming of monsters, why not let that miracle multiply?" With Clara's help, and the overwhelming support of families who had once watched their children tremble in silence, Florence transformed the abandoned property into an integrated healing center. Here, abandoned dogs, after behavioral and health checks, joined the Slow Trust program, a gentle training regimen where the goal wasn't obedience, but companionship. Some of the dogs had scars from abuse, some had been left behind on battlefields, others were simply never chosen, but all were now called the same: the Watchers. At the first private opening ceremony, Florence stood before a small group of 5 families and 7 dogs. Her hands trembled on the microphone, but her eyes gleamed brighter than ever. "Today," she said, "we're not opening doors to the public. We're opening them to unnamed memories." Beside her, Aegis, now honored as Captain of the Watchers, stood tall, his gaze fixed not on the adults but on the children. "We don't train dogs to do extraordinary things," Florence continued. "We remind them that their presence is already enough. They don't speak, but they listen. They don't judge, but they stay." Micah sat in the front row, his familiar one-eared teddy bear in hand. As Aegis passed, the boy looked up and called out, clear and confident, as though opening a long locked door, "Woof, woof!" Aegis paused, turned, walked to him, and gently rested his head on the boy's knee. No commands, no language, just recognition. Florence wiped away tears, smiling. "We named it Aegis Haven because at some point we all wished for a place to lean on, and now we get to offer that to others." That evening, Clara sat on the wooden steps of the main lodge. Aegis lay beside her. The early winter wind whispered through the pine ridge beyond. Across the field, a young boy practiced leading a dog named Echo through a soft obstacle course. Clara stroked Aegis's back, her voice quiet, like someone speaking not for reply but remembrance. You didn't just stop danger, Aegis. You became the reason people still believe. Aegis didn't move, eyes closed, still as a stone, steady as a compass, a quiet dog. And yet, a guide with no need for a map. The small park behind the Marlow Ridge Library glowed in the early summer light. Sunbeams streamed through the oak canopy, casting gold onto freshly trimmed grass. A light breeze carried the scent of young pine and the cheerful chatter of birds. In a corner paved with cobblestones, a 3-year-old boy laughed aloud, his tiny arms wrapped around a tennis ball almost the size of his head. Micah Nolan toddled across the lawn, cheeks flushed pink, curls flying wild in the wind. Every step came with a gleeful shout, "Aegis! Doggy, go get it!" Aegis, now 9 years old, no longer launched himself with youthful force, but he was still fast enough to chase the ball, snatch it mid-air, and return with unmistakable pride in his eyes. Micah clapped. Aegis wagged his tail, then lowered his head so the boy could throw his arms around his neck. On a wooden bench nearby, Florence and Clara sat in the shade. Florence held a cup of herbal tea, eyes locked on her grandson. Clara leaned back, jacket tied loosely around her waist. 3 months ago, Florence whispered, he wouldn't even step off the porch. And now look at him. Clara smiled, but didn't reply immediately. Her eyes were focused on the way Aegis gently lowered himself to Micah's level, so the boy could place a tiny cap on his head and declare, "You're an officer now, got it?" A simple moment, seemingly ordinary. But to Clara, it was living proof that trauma, if met with patience and presence, can be repainted in softer colors. "Some heroes," Clara said softly, her voice threading between bird song, "don't need to roar or wear medals. They just need to bark at the right time." Florence turned to her, a small smile glimmering in eyes that had lost countless nights of sleep, but today held something rare. The return of faith. Aegis had never liked fanfare. Even during award ceremonies when he was named K9 of the Year, when his image graced newspapers as a symbol of redemptive instinct, he would sit quietly, ears alert, eyes always on the exit. He didn't need the spotlight. He only needed to stand in the right place at the right time. Like today. Under a nearby tree, Micah sat with cookie crumbs still on his lips, scribbling in a notebook with colored markers. 2 round figures appeared, one of him, one of Aegis, with a rainbow and sun between them. In wobbly letters he wrote, "Doggy never left me." Florence wiped her eyes. Clara stood and slowly walked toward her 2 old teammates. Aegis lifted his head, ears twitching at the sound of familiar footsteps, then shifted slightly, making space. Clara sat beside Micah and gently rubbed his back as she looked at the drawing. "That's right. He never left you. And you shouldn't leave anyone who needs to be seen." Micah nodded, firmly. The sun tilted westward, tinting Micah's cheek in amber light. Aegis stretched out under the tree, eyes half closed, but his ears still flicked every so often. He always listened, not out of fear, but because he had grown accustomed to the world's unusual silences. Clara checked her watch, then glanced at Florence. "Ever thought about opening a second branch of Aegis Haven?" Florence nodded. "If there are more kids like Micah and more dogs like Aegis, then one place won't be enough." Clara looked toward the distant hills. "I'll always come back. Some lessons don't come from training sessions. They come from a pair of eyes, from one timely bark." Florence reached out and gently squeezed her shoulder. "You're a guardian, too, just like him." As the day wound down, Aegis stood, shook out his fur, and walked to the small rise near the gate, his favorite lookout point. He didn't bark, didn't chase anything. He simply stood there, still as a statue, his eyes scanning the world ahead. He wasn't young anymore. Silver streaks marked his back. His stride had slowed, but that never made him less, because his place was at the threshold, where shadows try to enter, and he was always standing guard. Florence held Micah's hand. Clara stood beside them. Together they watched the dog. Nothing extraordinary happened, but in that moment hearts fell silent, whispering their gratitude. We often see dogs as loyal companions, but sometimes, within their quiet instincts, lies a truth far greater than we imagine. Aegis was not a superhero. He was a German shepherd once abandoned, once broken, and perhaps because of that, he could sense what others missed: the cold in a hug that should have been warm, the pause in a heartbeat that should have trusted. His story is a quiet reminder. Animals don't just need love, they love us back in ways we may never fully understand. Sometimes, a glance, a perfectly timed bark, is all it takes to stop something terrible. And in a world full of noise, it might just be the silent loyalty of a dog. That keeps the darkness at bay. German shepherds aren't just strong or smart. They are living symbols of unwavering presence, of how healing begins not with words, but with being there. If you've ever been loved by a dog, you know, they never forget you, even if you forget them. So if you can, don't turn away from those waiting in shelters, because perhaps one of them is already standing guard for someone you haven't met yet.